Council Chair, we are now live.
Good morning. This hearing is called to order. I recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members. Members of the committee in attendance are Vice Chairman Brian O'Neill, Majority Leader Sherelle Parker, Council members Bobby Heenan, Isaiah Thomas, Kathy Gilmore Richardson, Kendra Brooks, Maria Canones Sanchez, Mark Squilla, Curtis Jones Jr., and Cindy Bass. This is the public hearing of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility and Intergovernmental Cooperation. The purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony on Resolution 200406. This resolution was introduced with co-sponsors, Council members Parker, Green, Canones Sanchez, Squilla, Gilmore, Richardson, Bass, and Thomas. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We're using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before this committee today.
Authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report, and as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority.
Thank you to all my colleagues who are attending today, and thank you to those who have agreed to testify. We all look forward to what you have to say, but I would ask that we try and be as concise as possible to honor people's time and allow for us to ask as many questions to get answers as concisely as possible. So let's get started. Ms. Gerbach, please call the first panel of witnesses.
The first panel is Harvey Rice, Rob DeBoe, Marissa Waxman, Christian Dunbar, Sarah DeWolf, and Chris Root.
Let's start with Harvey Rice, the PICA Executive Director. Good morning, Harvey. And please state your name for the record.
Good morning, Chair, Councilman Dom, and members of the City Council Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation Committee. My name is Harvey Rice. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, PICA, the state oversight agency for the City of Philadelphia. Thank you for allowing me to testify today to speak about PICA's report on the quarterly City Manager's Report, or the QCMR, for the fourth quarter of the fiscal year 2020, which ended June 30th. That report includes the months of April, May, and June. And PICA's reports on the city revenues and obligations for July and August of fiscal year 2021. I have prepared a short PowerPoint presentation with the highlights of our report on the QCMR, as well as a synopsis of our revenue and budget obligations reports. Can everyone see the PowerPoint presentation?
I don't think we're seeing it yet.
Is it up on the screen now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. The fourth quarter of the fiscal year ended with a fund balance of $254.9 million. As you can see, it was significantly lower than the actual fund balance at the end of fiscal year 19. However, it was about $45 million over the 5-year plan projection. But what we got to keep in mind is if you look at the end of the second quarter, the projected fund balance was around $362 million. So what it tells us is that for the first 9 months of fiscal year 20, the city was experiencing the results of the economic recovery, and we're seeing projections higher for a fund balance than they projected in their 5-year plan. And then March hit, and then we saw the impact of COVID on the fund balance. And then, as you can see, also on the revenues actual were $4.86 billion. The projected for the 5-year plan was $4.9 million, but that target was readjusted to include almost $5.1 billion. So there was the loss of about $300 million as a result of the last 3 months of fiscal year 20. We also saw obligations grow from FY19, but did not reach the projections that were in the 5-year plan. I can't get it. Okay. So this next slide is the revenue and obligations. It gives you a picture of the actual projection and the FY20 Q4 projection, and then same with obligations. The current net revenue projection for the fiscal year 2020 is $4.6 billion, $57.6 million below the plan projection. And the obligations were projected at $5.87 billion, an increase of $61.9 million from the plan. The quarterly revenue projection decreased by $78.6 million, while obligations decreased by $65.5 million from the third quarter target projections during the year of FY20. Which one? This one. So here's the general fund summary, which I already spoke about, the projections for the decrease in revenues and the increase in obligations and the fund balance. The fund balance of $254.9 million represents 5% of total obligations, which neither meets the city's internal goal of 6.8% or the GFA's recommendation of 17%. However, the prior year, FY19, the city was getting closer to their goal of 8%, and as a result of COVID, it impacted the fund balance and their internal goal. Goes which one? You went back. Okay, and this next slide shows you revenues by type, and that means taxes, locally generated non-tax revenue, revenue from other governments, and revenue from funds. As you can see, it shows you the decreases or the effects of the 5-year plan and the projections over the course of 2020. And here's projected obligations by class. The wages increased, employee benefits decreased, purchase of services slightly increased, and then as you can go down. So the total there was a $62 million increase in obligations. Staffing has been increasing since the FY14, the fourth quarter, going forward. But then, as you see in FY 2020, the second quarter, which is the end of December, you can see the drop, and that probably is most likely due to the hiring freeze during the COVID pandemic that impacted us in March. Overtime, as you know, PICA has been very concerned with the increase in overtime. In fact, in FY20, I think it's been the largest overtime cost reported. And as a result of that, when the PICA board approved the 5-year plan in July, they requested of the city overtime reduction plan, which was submitted last week. We were reviewing it. We've also asked for action plans by department and target numbers, which have not yet come in the initial draft of the plan that was submitted last week. Leave usage, we track leave usage because one of the reasons shows if you have a higher leave usage, you might have the department might have a higher overtime cost. So we look at leave usage of all the departments. The civilian employees of the police department recorded the highest leave usage, and that's been pretty consistent. As you can see along that red line, in a lot of the quarters, they tend to be the highest. And in our last quarter, the Register of Wills had the lowest leave usage. And then we looked at, in our quarterly report, performance targets by the city for these departments, from police, fire, prisons, license inspection, human services, public health, homeless services, free library, housing, community development, parks and recreation, and streets department. So out of all those departments, there were targets of 39 performance metrics to meet. The city met 17 of them and missed 22. And then I want to talk about the city tax revenues through August for fiscal year 2021. We released this report. The city collected approximately $333 million in August, compared to $214 million in 2020, which was an increase of $18 million. But however, you have to keep in mind that the Burke collections came in July 15th, which are reflected in these numbers. So it is skewing the tax revenue collections for this year. And we won't know the breakout of the Burke from FY19 FY20 payments and the following fiscal year until sometime in October, as the city is breaking them out. So when you see the city has collected $711 million through August compared to $468 million last year, an increase of 51.9%, you have to keep in mind that those Burke and real estate taxes are included in that, and both of them had extensions to pay. And then city's obligations through August. We also we're following them monthly. We issued our first report and included both months of July and August, as we were working with the city to get as much information as we could get so that we could review and analyze. And so the city spent a little higher than the city does not keep monthly budgets. So what we did was we took the overall projected obligations divided by 12, which gives you an annualized monthly spend of 16.6%. And they spent so far 18.6%, which is higher than if you separate them out by month. However, in the initial, there's more encumbrances that are paid in the initial part of in the beginning of the year. So we have to keep that in mind as we follow this monthly obligations cost going forward. However, it was lower than the 2 months spending of last year. And so that ends my presentation. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I'm available for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Harvey Rice. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I also would like to acknowledge at this time Council members Jamie Gautier and Council member Helen Gim. Welcome. Good morning. And I have some questions for you, Harvey. I wanted to ask you on this report. In general, how much would you say since the pandemic started we've lost in revenue in total, and how much in extra expense have we incurred? Like, what is Delta? We know when the council had to approve a budget, there was a $750 million hole. Where are we right now in relationship to that $750 million?
I think we're around the same. It might be a little lower right now, but I think we won't know till all the revenues come in and processed and the accruals are accounted for. So okay. Right now, it looks like we're on the projection of having those revenue losses.
And just to confirm, you're getting monthly revenue and monthly expenses from the administration, so
yes,
you could give us a heads up too as to if there's any issues.
Right. We will be issuing those monthly reports every month, so you'll get a monthly revenue report and a monthly obligation report.
Okay. Let me go to a question I have. The overtime is going to be, I guess, a series of questions I'm not going to address right now, but I want to go to the leave usage report. I found that to be a very interesting report, but I want to make sure that we understand the chart that you provided us. When it says, for example, I'm looking at records department and police civilian because they seem to be the highest. It says records leave usage between like 42%. Explain what that actually means. Does that mean that 42% of the days they're not out of 100 they're not there?
It's just it's the percentage of vacation and sick time taken by the employees. So it's not the number of days. It could be, but we look at the vacation and sick days taken by each department, and the city provides. The city provides that data to us.
But when those numbers, I mean, I don't know what the norm is, but it seems like we have a lot above 10%. And I'm just looking at it in a basic way and saying, if I have 100 days I'm working, if I'm at 10%, 10 days I'm not there roughly. And so like police civilian I see is 40%. Does that mean that 4 out of 10 days they're not working?
It does.
And that's an interesting chart because they probably have to have overtime.
And I think one Philly coming is supposed to capture all that. And it's capturing more than before. That's one of the benefits of one Philly.
Okay. I mean, it just seems like some of these numbers seem really high.
They are, and that's why we report on them, because we believe there could be a correlation between that leave usage and overtime.
Yeah.
Because if people aren't coming in doing their job, and that job needs to be done, and there's timelines by getting permits processed, or police on the streets, or anything, then they go to employees that are there to work overtime to complete those tasks.
Right. I mean, I think, have you sat down with the city administration, shared this and gone over this? Because I think this is a very valuable report and a great tool for us to use for management of
We're
this?
we're going to we're meeting with the city over on the overtime reduction plan. As we're going through their plan that they submitted last week, we're going through, we have some things that aren't included in the plan that we would like, and this would be part of it, of how we can, because what we believe it's a direct, as I said, direct correlation between that and overtime. So obviously it is going to be in our discussion with the city when they do these target plans for overtime. They got to look at the leave usage of those departments. They have to take that into consideration.
Okay. The next question I have is the city departments. By the way, your charts are phenomenal. You did a great job with the charts and the information.
Thank you.
The city department, it's really good. The department performance targets, fiscal year 2020. That chart that shows
Yes.
39 targets or goals. And it looks like we achieved 17 of them.
Right.
And we missed on 22 of them. It looks like we achieved, just simple math, around 44% of our goals.
Right.
So my question is, are we not being efficient, or are the goals that are being set not realistic?
I think a couple things is, in certain goals, yes, we're not being efficient. Two, COVID, I think, through everything for the last 3 months, where those goals were being hard to meet. People weren't processing permits. The parks and recreation, the programs weren't for after school, things like that. So that had an impact. But also, and we believe that and we've been working with the city over the course of a year to better present targets and metrics that actually reflect the mission of each department and the services that the citizens, we believe, deserve and that are of a priority.
Have you looked at these performance measures and made any recommendations to the administration on how we could improve the performance measures?
Yes, it's actually a constant back and forth with the city as we review their quarterly reports.
Okay.
And they've adjusted some through our recommendations. They've adjusted some and included metrics that we thought were important, such as the recreation after school programs, instead of just how many acres of grass were cut. That's just one example. We're still working with fire to have them better look at their metrics. They're doing that in a comprehensive way.
Is that list something you could share with council, this committee, and I could share with everybody?
Sure.
Of your recommendations?
Yeah, we have them by those departments. We have the metrics, and I can share them with you.
Okay.
Right.
I want to recognize, by the way, Council Member Derek Green. Good morning, Derek.
Yeah.
Morning, Council Member. And now I'd like to go to open it up for questions. I think Council Member Curtis Jones Jr. Is up first. So, Council Member Jones, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for putting together this quarterly stability hearing. It's going to become increasingly important as we approach the budget season. Mr. Henry, thank you for doing Mr. Rice, thank you for doing the work, the hard work of counting and holding us accountable as a municipality for prioritizing our expenditures. My questions revolve around a couple of things. Number one, when you talk about time usage, are you taking into account that departments like the police department, the prisons, and sanitation were hit very hard with COVID infections, and their workforce was reduced to a point where we had police working during the civil unrest, 20-hour work days, and we had a week's backup from sanitation for trash pickups, and so therefore the use of overtime was an essential part of keeping the city operating. Same can be said for the prisons. They were also hit hard by COVID-19 and were then asked to maintain a safe population to guard ratio, which they attempted to do in a healthy, socially distanced environment. Are you taking those things into consideration?
Well, yes. If you look, the three departments that you spoke about, take out the police civilian, the actual police force, they were in the median. So was L&I, so was prisons, and so was streets. So they weren't an outlier even during that time. So for leave usage, and then yes, we do take in consideration. We're taking for COVID for overtime in certain departments, such as streets, the police department, and prisons. So we are taking that into effect. However, some of those departments had high overtime prior to COVID, so we question those overtime numbers before March.
Are you also considering in other departments, when the issue of Class 100 staff furloughs came up, that there might have been in certain departments a panic and or a rush to take unused leave time in anticipation of people being furloughed? Was that considered?
No, we didn't consider that.
Then my final point is slightly different. Were there any surprises in projected revenues that were positive? It's my understanding, I don't know if it's true and need your verification, that we came in slightly ahead on wage taxes. And if so, we did?
We did.
Can you explain that?
20, and also for.
Can you explain that to me, considering people often were working from home outside of the city, and how did that anomaly actually happen in your mind?
One, there's a timing issue, but you're right, Councilman, because when I saw that, I said maybe the impact of COVID for people working isn't what we expected. So that maybe that's a silver lining or a ray of sunshine a little bit. But as I've said in my testimony, it's only 2 months. I don't want to really set the stage for the year with just 2 months revenues. We have to follow this going forward. But you're correct. I was surprised and pleasantly surprised that our wages came in higher than last year.
Were there any other tax revenue categories that were not as dramatic, but a surprise as well?
Well, real estate taxes came in, and the real estate transfer tax was coming in very well until these last 2 months. It dipped a little bit. We were up until the August numbers. We thought that that was doing really well. But other than that, the rest of the tax revenues, we see a decrease.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Jones. And I'd like to ask Councilmember Helen Gim. I know she has questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And good morning, Harvey.
Good morning,
Thank you
Councilwoman.
very much for your presentation. So a couple of questions that I had are, in terms of when you look at declines in wage and tax revenue, do you at all take a look at how they are declining by the number of people, like the amount of money that the wage tax that is maybe transferred out to the counties because people are now working at home instead of in the city, but that they are continuing to work?
We can't look at that now. I think when we need to look at it is when they file their reimbursements to see what that impact will be. And that is sometime in the spring. So we don't know what that number will be yet. I think we're projecting around 20 million loss in wage tax revenue. So that's why I say that when we give out the 2 months, snapshot, we don't want to either alarm or be overly optimistic because it is only 2 months.
Okay. And then I guess one of the reasons why, and then whether you can tell whether the loss of, like, say, some of our larger companies or corporate folks who are now working out of county but still working, how much that comprises a percentage of the wages lost overall from the city. Are you able to do anything like that as in terms of an analysis?
We could do that. What I can do is we'll see if we can get the data citywide and regionally to see if we can put that together.
I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is that part of your role is to give advice and perspectives. And if the COVID, there's a number of companies that are looking internally at return to work policies. Some of them are looking into the spring of 2021. It's hard to tell whether it extends beyond that. But I guess one of the questions is what percentage of the wage tax feels more permanent and what could be more in flux, and are there recommendations that you're providing around some of that in terms of planning and understanding, like return to work policies and that kind of thing?
It's still, I believe it's still unfolding right as of now, because as you're right, Councilwoman, that date keeps on moving, because I was ready to have my staff come back, and then it was put on hold again. So it's and now with what we're hearing, that the fall and the early winter could see a resurge. So it's an unfolding, unprecedented.
So I don't want to get caught up in whether or when companies will do a return to work policy. I'm trying to understand what percentage of our wage tax could be reliant on seeing an increase back should companies start to do return to work. So it's kind of more like an understanding about that. And I don't know if you can do that, whether you can break that down.
We can't do that right now because those returns need to be filed. So when those returns are filed, as I mentioned earlier, then we'll have a better picture of how many were out, how much did we lose, and that when those people come back, then how much will we reclaim back into the wage tax.
Right.
As our economist, and I think the city's economist team, we sort of met together on at the same around 20 million, but it's a difficult projection because there is a process to file for those refunds. And so it's an active process that every employee that is working outside the city must do. So that might be to the city's benefit, depending on how many people file for that refund.
Right. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, like, part of PICA's role is to help us understand revenue expenditure issues so that we can have a sense of sustainability and predictability about the time ahead. And so, to have some kind of an analysis of the workforce, out of county workforce, is helpful because it gives us a sense of, what's somewhat, what kind of pot of money are we talking about that's shifting back and forth depending on these, workplace policies. So I'd love to be able to follow up with you on that.
Okay.
The other thing that I wanted to ask was whether PICA had done, this is the second year that the administration has proposed no property tax assessments to occur. And do you have some, is that factored into any of your revenue projections or anything like that? As opposed to like, if we were to do, now it may be that you don't really weigh in on whether we don't do any property tax assessments, right, or whether we do revenue neutral types of property, right, tax assessments.
We don't do revenue projections. We take the city's revenue projections, okay, and we review and analyze them, put them through our economic model, and to see whether those projections are reasonable and appropriate. And so if the city says they're not going to do property assessments for the coming year, and so their projection should be along the same as last year's, and they come with a projection that's way lower or way higher, then we would have to say, well, why, if you're not doing reassessments, why are your numbers either higher or lower than last year's projections? And there might be reasons for that. We put it through our model, just sales of houses or whatever. But so we don't do revenue projections. We review and analyze and put them through our economic models to make sure that the projections the city is putting forward are reasonable and appropriate.
Got it. And then I know that I've raised this before, but how does the school district's finances factor into your 5-year plan on the city end?
The school district's finances factor in our 5-year plan in two ways. One is the amount that the city directly gives to the school district. We take that and we make sure that the city has enough money to make that payment. And then two, the property tax, and we review and analyze the property tax because, the school district gets 55% of the property tax. So we have to make sure that the projections for the property tax, again, are reasonable and appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Gammon. And now I'd like to call upon Councilmember Maria Quinones-Sanchez.
Thank you, and thank you for addressing some of the school district issues by my council member, Gim, because I was in line with what I was going to ask you. At any time, does the city ask you to give an opinion around these decisions around assessments? And then especially because it means they have to modify their plan, doesn't it? How's the reconciliation happen between them making a policy decision, it has a revenue impact, and then do you give an opinion to that?
We don't give an opinion. What happens is if the city administration or the city does something during the course of the year of the plan that we're in, and that shows that that affects revenues not coming what was projected, or they start another department and allocate additional monies to a department, then that's a variance to the plan. And so what then occurs is we go to the city and say, you have a variance in the plan. These that's why we follow it every month, and then the quarterly reports. These revenue projections, you're not meeting them either because they're not coming in, or you shifted the way of collecting them, and then you need to revise your plan, which then we review and analyze again. It goes to the board, and then they have to vote on it. If the board decides not to accept that plan, then it starts a whole procedure where we go back to the city. We tell them why they didn't accept the plan, and then the city has to give us another revised plan to meet those concerns. If not, then it would probably be rejected again, and then state funding could stop flowing to the city.
So, okay, so I appreciate that. So let's go to where we are now. And I know that, in the discrepancies with the numbers, because we moved the deadline for Burt and some other things, and we have to wait for those reconciliations. What is PICA's role in reviewing, particularly some of the areas of concern that you've had historically and how they're manifesting themselves during COVID? And so let me explain. The CARES Act, you mentioned, and to the chairman's point, I appreciate you correlating overtime, historical overtime mismanagement to some of the leave folks. But how are you seeing this play out with the CARES Act money? And are we really in line to spend, use, and leverage that? And how does that correlate, or do you think there's a correlation with some of the numbers that you demonstrated on leave and overtime?
Well, on the first matter, we have requested from the city a breakdown of the CARES Act money, and they're in the process of compiling that for us, so that we can see where it went. Did it go? What did it go for? Salaries? Did it go for contracts? Did it go into overtime? And by department. That's what we requested, and they're compiling that for us. So we'll have a better sense of what is reimbursable on those overtime numbers.
I know that one of...
Go ahead.
No, I know one of the, again, in our budget work group, we've been asking this question of the administration. What, if anything, of the federal guidelines around CARES Act expenditure has PICA reviewed, and have you issued an opinion about some of the expenditures to date?
No, we have not looked at that. We understand that the city has hired a consultant who's going to assist them in making sure that they spend every appropriation of the CARES Act according to the federal guidelines under the CARES Act, and they will be supplying us with that information as that. I know the consultant was picked. I don't know if they've started yet, but that will be something that we'll be following with the city to make sure that they meet the guidelines, and they spend, if not as much of, if not all, of the $750 million that the city has. The federal government has given the city so far for the CARES Act.
So given our ability in the past to kind of manage the cash flow related to the expenditures, do you see us ready and prepared and having the systems in place to be able to actually spend that money by the end of the year? We're having debate around how you prioritize some of that money with the administration, but I also want to make sure that we have the mechanism to actually spend down, given the cash flow and the reconciliation that needs to happen.
I think the city will be spending, and that's why they hired a consultant to make sure that they spend it by the end of December, and they spend it appropriately so that when it goes through the process in the federal government, they don't get hit with a bill that, this amount of dollars was not spent according to the CARES Act, and then we have to return it at some point.
Do you, so when are they supposed to respond to you around some of this CARES Act delineation and reconciliation? By when? And Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask you as chair of this committee, I'd like for us to have a public conversation about how that CARES Act is being allocated, prioritized, leveraged, and spent. And I know we had a little bit of that conversation in some of the hearings. We've heard from different sectors, whether it's the rental assistance sector, whether it's the business sector, that we need to make bigger investments in some of those markets. How long is it before you're going to get that information, and when can we have a kind of public discussion about it?
We're hoping to get it very shortly. We have conversations with the city ongoing, almost, if not daily, at least a couple of times a week. So we keep them abreast of our concerns and our requests, and what I understand is that once this consultant gets underway, we will have that. I don't have an actual date, though.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll follow up and make sure that we can have that public discussion. I want to make sure that we're not leaving any money on the table and that we're making investments based on priority. I'm very concerned that the correlation between the leave spending and the overtime, as opposed to us putting money on the ground. So I just want to make sure that, this money is for us to activate, and restart our economy. And we just want to make sure it just doesn't go into a dark hole. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. I have a very accurate point about that, so thank you. I'd like to acknowledge Councilmember David O, who's joined, and also recognize Councilmember O. I know you have a question.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I was wondering if, in your analysis, did you come across any information about cost savings, being that the city has not been operating? Have you come across information about how much money has been saved by the city?
Not really. We just looked at the numbers and what the numbers report from year to year and from projection of the plan to the final. Over time, for the first 2 months of FY21, went down from the prior year. I'll give you around a little over 30%. It went down, but again, I just want to caution everyone. It's only 2 months, so while we're glad to see that it went from almost 40 million to 25 million, we hope that continues, and that could be a result of COVID. That once the city got into after the first 3 months and they got into a stable environment, working environment, that those costs were decreased.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, I'd like to call upon Councilmember Derek Queen. Might have your mute button on. Councilmember Green, we're not hearing you very well.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, had a little technical difficulties. Thank you, Mr. Rice. Thank you,
Thank you, Councilman.
Councilmember Don, for holding these hearings quarterly. Just want to echo some of the comments that have been raised, but I want to focus a little bit more on some of the conversation, especially in reference to the administration's ability to spend the recovery dollars. Councilmember Sanchez asked a question in reference to when you will get that information in reference to CARES dollars being spent. We are on the verge of almost October, and those dollars have to be spent by December. From your experience in reference to this, looking how the city has spent dollars, is there any concern from your perspective, our ability to spend those dollars in a time period quickly?
Not really, because if we go back and some of the grants that we followed, they've spent. So we're not concerned right now. If come November 1st, and they still need to spend, a significant portion of the federal grant, then we would be concerned. However, preliminary, while they didn't give us reports, the preliminary numbers that we discussed, it looks like they're spending them. And I think the hiring of the consultant, and I think the city's on today. You can ask them questions about the consultant and how much work they've done so far on this. And that'll also be a factor of whether we have a concern or not.
Mm-hmm. The reason I raise this, I think this hints to some of the questions and concerns that members have raised. We are in a policy debate regarding how those dollars should be spent. I know through various sources, we know that there's been additional flexibility on those federal CARES dollars. But a concern that I have, especially when you look at our small businesses that have been decimated by this global pandemic and the desire for additional dollars to be spent, we can end up being in a debate between the executive branch and the legislative branch and how dollars should be spent. And then we get up to a timeline, and then administration will say, well, we've got to spend these dollars now, so let's spend it in this direction, which does raise a concern. Also want to get your perspective. Also want to get some perspective as we go into this budget season and prepare, getting ready for the budget season, as various departments are now looking at their projections and information as we prepare for the upcoming budget. What are your perspectives in reference to revenues as we go into a budget season and new fiscal year of us being able to continue to meet our goals, especially in reference to revenue obligations? I do have some concerns because of going to colder weather months. Some of our restaurants and retail establishments will continue to be impacted. You're starting to see an uptick in a number of cases around the country in various states, which could also have an impact here in Pennsylvania. And then we have our contracts are coming up that need to be addressed with our municipal unions, as well as the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers and the school district are working on contracts. So give me some perspective on your concerns on how that will impact the 5-year plan, especially as we go into next year's budget season.
As I stated earlier, I think it was on Councilwoman Gim's question. What we're seeing is there could be an advent, like a resurgence again of the pandemic in the fall and winter. Right now, Philadelphia is doing very well in the number of cases, dropping significantly and leveling off. So it is a concern. That's why we're following it monthly. And we look at what as the month revenues come in, we have a sense of what they should be. And if they're significantly not, then when we get the quarterly report for the first quarter, which we'll get November 15th, then if there's a variance, then we'll say to the city, the revenues are not coming in. You have to revise your plan to have your expenses meet your revenues. And then they have to submit it to PICA. So it's a constant monitoring effort that we do almost daily, basically. And then when we see that variance or we see that variance coming, we say to the city, you got to revise your plan because you're not meeting your projections, or you will not meet your projections for revenue. And then that's going to affect the 5-year plan that gets submitted for FY22. Sometime the proposed one in March, and then that process begins through the budget process, and then the actual plan that's submitted sometime in June.
One final question. There have been, the states also had significant impact by COVID in reference to their budget, and there's already been some conversations that'll have to be significant reductions in health and behavioral health dollars that come to counties around the Commonwealth. Philadelphia, being both a city and a county, received a significant amount of dollars by way of block grants that come to the city, which we provide for behavioral health and health services across the board. If those cuts do come to fruition because of the challenges the state have, and we've had a significant reduction in our resources to deal with COVID this year, what would be the city's ability to make up those differences, if at all, if we go into the next fiscal year?
Well, the only way the city's ability to make up them is they would have to cut costs somewhere else to make up for those costs that they're going to incur because they're not getting funded by the state or the pass-through for their federal government.
Right, which could lead to an even more significant reduction in resources during this COVID pandemic, especially for those who need behavioral health services or other health services, especially if they can't receive, especially if the city does not receive any type of revenue reimbursement at the federal level, which probably will not occur at the earliest first quarter of 2021 or second quarter, depending on what happens in November, as well as some of the concerns you raised. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. And Executive Director Rice, I just want to give you a heads up and get your thoughts on this. You mentioned the transfer tax being down. Is that probably because we're still seeing residential transactions at a pretty good clip, but the commercial world, probably there's very little sales going on in the commercial world, which are the bigger numbers?
I think you're right, Councilman. I think it's the impact of commercial sales, because everything that I've seen and read on that is that residential sales are still going stronger than people projected during the COVID.
Right. And then the other question, I guess, that we have to look at is what's going to happen to the commercial real estate taxes when are people going to be filing a whole bunch of reassessment, filings to lower their taxes, because the values of a lot of commercial properties with rents going down, they're all measured on cap rates. They will drop in value, which will be less revenue for us.
And I think you're correct, and that's why I think it's the first Monday in October when the filings are due for them. So that will tell us early October what the potential impact may be on the refunds to real estate tax.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, PICA. Thank you, Executive Director Rice. It's a great presentation, and thank you very much for all your information you provided us. So now I'd like to call on Rob DeBoe, our Finance Director. Of course, to state your name for the record, begin your testimony. In the interest of time, can I ask that we please hold presenting your information on overtime spending until this afternoon's session, during which time that issue will be addressed in detail. And when you cover the recovery slides, maybe we can just skim through the background information and focus on the issues in play, the funding priorities, and the oversight of the spending. So thank you, Rob, and please proceed, and good morning.
Good morning, Chair Dom, and members of the Council Committee on Fiscal Stability. I'm Rob DeBoe, the Finance Director, and I'm joined by Budget Director Marissa Waxman, City Treasurer Christian Dunbar, as well as Sarah DeWolf and Chris Root, co-leaders of the city's recovery. They'll be giving a separate presentation on what we're doing with recovery. For this hearing, we'll focus on the FY20 results as reported in the fourth quarter FY20 quarterly city managers report, which was released in mid-August. We asked us to hold on overtime management. There is text in here about what we're doing there and the report we gave to PICA, and the officials testifying this afternoon will give more details on what's happening with their specific departments. And we'll talk about FY21 year-to-date results. So let's start with FY20. And as I said, and as Harvey mentioned, since our last hearing, we released the quarterly report for the fourth quarter of FY20. I won't go into a lot of details on the numbers because Harvey went through that, but I will point out that, as is the case each year, we haven't yet finalized our books for FY20, and we won't be doing that until late October. So while the quarterly report shows that we're projecting the city will end FY20 with a fund balance of about 5% of obligations, or $255 million, those numbers will likely move by the time we finalize our books in August. So the 5% is higher than the fund balance included in the FY20 to 24 5-year plan, but below our goal of having a fund balance equal to 6.6 to 8% of expenditures, and is unchanged from the level estimated in the plan that PICA approved this July. I'm going to skip ahead to talk a little about the performance measures. Harvey talked about that a little, but I want to point out that even in the midst of the pandemic, when you look at all of our measures, over half of them met or exceeded their target, which is below the 2/3 of measures that met or exceeded targets in FY19. But that's not surprising given the decline in the city shutdown of non-essential services in the last quarter. And to give some examples, libraries closed to the public, so in-person visits dropped to zero. DHS saw a 22% decline for the year in the number of dependents placed into kinship care, the preferred option, and that's as a result of courts being closed for most matters. And so in some instances, FY20 targets were revised to reflect the changed circumstances, but not in all. Just to reemphasize that we're going to continue working with budget and accounting, revenue, and city treasurer's office to finalize our year-end balance. That having a healthy fund balance is essential to ensure that we can adequately respond to the unexpected, including the kind of things that Councilman Green was bringing up. I won't go into the detail of overtime because you asked us to skip that, but just want to point out that we did provide a report to PICA last week, and that report's available publicly. For FY21 to date, so as Harvey pointed out, since the last hearing, we've completed the first 2 months of the fiscal year. And for those first 2 months, spending's been below projections and revenues are meeting estimates. And while that's heartening, it will be much more meaningful to review spending and revenue once the first quarter ends and more data can be analyzed. A single month's results can be distorted by the timing of when a contract is encumbered or how many pay periods included in a month. And as in past years, we'll continue to provide monthly reports on revenue collections to Council, PICA, and the Controller's Office, as well as posting those online. And at the request of PICA, and given our precarious financial situation, we've added monthly obligation reports with comparisons to prior years, and those are available on the city's website. That's all in addition to the quarterly city manager's report, mandated by state law, that the city produces to track spending, revenue, performance, and staffing data. To increase accessibility of the quarterly report, we've added a one-page summary document for those who don't want to take the deeper dive into the report, and we're incrementally upgrading the presentation of the larger document. This complements efforts to make budget documents more accessible, to include a summary of the 5-year plan in 4 pages and 7 languages for the first version of the 5-year plan. Once we have a full quarter's worth of data and performance and complete the target budget process, where we work with each department to update revenue, spending, and performance information, we'll be refining estimates for FY21. The target budget process, which has just started, should be finished by mid-October. Any deviations that require an adjustment in appropriations by class or department will be captured in a proposed mid-year transfer ordinance, and then through the Committee on Appropriations, Council will receive briefings on any proposed changes. With continued management monitoring and collaboration with Council, we'll adjust the budget to respond to the changing needs of Philadelphians. As we maneuver through this public health emergency and economic crisis, we'll seek to maintain Philadelphia's fiscal stability to ensure we can support our residents and provide the services they rely on. The year-to-date information has not given us any reason to change our FY21 forecasts. And as a reminder, we're projecting an FY21 fund balance of $53 million, which is only about 1.1% of spending, far below our goal and the Government Finance Offers Association recommendation for fund balances should be. We have set aside reserves for specific costs or scenarios in the future, although less than previously planned. In FY21, $25 million is budgeted for costs associated with continuing to respond to the pandemic and reopening the economy that are not anticipated to be reimbursed with federal funds because they'll be incurred after the December 30th deadline for reimbursement under the CARES Act. While those reserves are below our administration's goal, the only other alternatives were to make deeper cuts that could have endangered our ability to recover from the pandemic. On recovery, our success in responding to the pandemic and having an inclusive recovery depends upon adequate resources from local, state, and federal sources and the careful deployment of those funds. And as I said, Chris and Sarah will give a more detailed presentation. I just want to give some highlights. We faced new expenses in responding to the public health crisis and increased costs to provide the services Philadelphians have always relied on. The needs are compounded by the dramatic reductions in local revenues the city is experiencing due to the economic slowdown. We've received significant grants from state and federal governments, but the amounts fall far short of our needs, and restrictions on the use of those dollars makes aligning spending of federal funds with our local priorities a challenge. To navigate those challenges, we've convened a recovery committee, which has representation from council. Additionally, council has legislative reporting of new grants related to the recovery to ensure the body remains well informed of the new resources received as they're awarded. We've received over 20 COVID-19 related grants totaling around $600 million, and each of those have their own constraints and timeframes governing how the funding can be used. And notably, none of those grants can be used to reimburse the general fund for lost revenue resulting from the impacts of COVID-19, and the city's needs continue to outweigh the funding that's available. As Harvey discussed, and as you hear more detail from Chris and Sarah, the most flexible of the funding sources the city has received is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. We received $276 million through this funding source. The funding can be used to cover necessary expenses resulting from the pandemic and public health emergency that were not accounted for in our budget at the time of passage and that were incurred between March 1st and December 30th. An interim report that we submitted to the Treasury mid-July reported we'd incurred eligible expenses totaling about $116 million, or 41% of the city's total CRF funds between March 1st and June 30th. That puts us on pace to spend the CRF dollars by the end of the year. And when we compared that pace to what we're seeing in other cities, we were kind of in the middle of the pack. The largest area of expenditures to date include payroll costs for public safety and public health personnel, substantially dedicated to our COVID-19 response, along with sizable expenses associated with medical and public health activities, such as standing up a medical surge facility and purchasing large quantities of personal protective equipment. Our strategy for the use of the funds is guided by three themes: protecting public health and safety of Philadelphians, protecting vulnerable residents, and ensuring the economic recovery from COVID-19. The use of those funds is also being guided by a focus on equity. The pandemic has disproportionately impacted low-income residents and communities of color, and the city's response must target assistance to those who've been most impacted. Initiatives such as food distribution, access centers, small business relief, rental assistance, and the public health response were designed with equity in mind. Again, Sarah and Chris will give more details, but I wanted to touch on some of the challenges we faced in using those funds. Most notable has been the lack of clarity from Washington about whether additional federal funding will be made available anytime soon, or whether rules will change to provide more flexibility on how funds can be used. For the time being, we must continue to plan for CRF funds to be spent by December 30th, meaning we're much more constrained in what we can spend in response to the new year. In addition, the formula that Congress uses to determine how much CRF funding Philadelphia would receive is population-based, and most of the CRF funds went to the states rather than directly to counties, to the disadvantage of Philadelphia. Philadelphia did receive direct money, like large cities. If we were a smaller city, like let's say Santa Fe, we would have to get money through our state. We're home to approximately 21% of the state's COVID-19 cases and 12% of the population, but we've received less than 6% of the state's total CRF funding. Harrisburg has deployed most of the CRF, but not all the CRF dollars through worthy programs, including investing hundreds of millions of dollars in small business relief and rental assistance, which have benefited Philadelphians. However, the impact of these programs and the extent and nature of their unmet needs is not yet clear, Harrisburg has still not decided how to spend more than $1 billion of the state's CRF dollars. We hope for more clarity on these issues in the weeks ahead to help inform future deployment of our scarce CRF dollars. And it's also worth noting that one of the challenges has been the continuing changing of the guidance from the federal government. We have received revised guidance a dozen times, including as recently as earlier this week. These additional constraints surrounding the funding mean the city must invest significant time and energy into ensuring necessary costs incurred due to the pandemic are matched to the best possible funding source, and they limit the flexibility we have in responding to the new needs resulting from the pandemic. Philadelphia is responding to new unanticipated long-term challenges within the context of taking all opportunities to increase equity and opportunity for all Philadelphians. As we near the end of the first quarter of FY21, we remain on track with the spending and revenues, and we'll share updates as the books are closed for FY20 and we have FY21 first quarter figures. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. We're happy to take any questions, and Chris and Sarah are here to provide more detail, and they have their own presentation.
Thank you, Finance Director DeBoe. Very comprehensive. I have a couple of questions, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Just in general, I know that you came to council and we talked about a $750 million deficit back in the spring. Is that still accurate, or is it higher or lower in your opinion?
So I answer it this way. We haven't seen anything in the first 2 months of this year that would make us change that estimate. We're continuing to monitor it. I think to the point Harvey made, we'll have a much better sense when we have a full quarter of obligations and revenues, because timing differences tend to smooth out better over a quarter than over a month or two. So I think hasn't changed yet, but we have to continue to monitor it carefully.
Okay. And then, you brought up an interesting point. Why is it that we receive 6% of the money when we have 12% of the population?
It's a really good question that's probably better addressed to Harrisburg, but I think Chris and Sarah will go into more of that in their presentation.
Sure. Okay. And then right now, as of today or last few weeks, do you have an idea of our total spending for the pandemic so far?
Total spending for the pandemic, we were actually putting those numbers together. They're not quite finalized. I think that's something that we'll probably have within the next week or two.
Okay, that's fine. And so I have a few other questions. Originally, back in the March budget, we were projected to end the fiscal year 20 with about $3.7 billion in tax revenue, and I think a $358 million fund balance. The revised budget, based on third quarter projections, estimated that we'd end fiscal year 20 with about $3.6 billion in revenue and a $268 million fund balance. So it sounds like we were able to take advantage of about $100 million in federal funding to keep us from completely wiping out our fund balance, which is good news. Do we have any final numbers, though, on exactly how the revenues, expenditures, and our fund balances ended up for fiscal year 20?
No, we each year we finalize the books in October. And so until those books are finalized, we don't know the final revenue numbers. And I'll give you one example. So for the business tax, every year there are credits taken, for example, and those are things that we have to analyze as we look through the returns. And that process takes until early October. So we don't have final revenue numbers yet.
Okay. Now, another question I have is this fiscal year, you've been pulling out reports on obligations and revenues for each month so far. And the reports mention that our obligations are higher in July than other months because that's when a lot of our contracts are renewed and debt service gets paid. So it sounds like July might be one of our bigger spending months. And are there months where we can expect to spend notably less than other months? And what kind of peaks and expenditures should we expect in these reports throughout the course of the fiscal year? And is it generally the contracts which determine the higher and lower obligations, or is there something else driving that?
So there are multiple things that will drive fluctuations in our spending. So one you touched upon, which is that we tend, in terms of obligations, to try to obligate our contracts early in the year. So that will show those numbers coming really early. Some of our debt service payments due in July. So, that will be a high month because of that. We make the bulk of our pension payments in March. There's one large payment in the first half of the year, but so you'll see a spike up in costs in March. The other thing that will drive differences between months is the number of pay periods. So if a month has more pay days than another month, you'll see an increase. So it kind of fluctuates, but other than July debt service payment months and the big pension payment months, I think the biggest driver is going to be the number of pay periods in a month.
Okay, but you're our finance director, and we have a lot of respect for you and what you do. And in your opinion, this seems to be okay with the track we're on right now regarding that issue.
Yeah, there's nothing that we've seen so far that makes us think, okay, these numbers are different from what we were projecting, but we will know much better after the quarter's over.
Okay. And then on the revenue side, how are revenues looking so far compared to the adopted budget? Which revenues are coming in lower than expected, and are there any coming in higher than expected? And are there any concerns you might have here?
Sure. In general, no concerns. I'm actually going to let Marissa give a more detailed answer on how our tax revenues look.
Sure. I'm Marissa Waxman, Budget Director, and similar to the obligation side, the revenues are looking good compared to our projections. There's nothing we're seeing yet that would cause us to make any adjustments in our forecasts. But again, once we see the results for the first quarter, then it'll be more meaningful and we'll look again. And in terms of impact on the overall budget, really watching the wage tax is the only thing that is really meaningful to do this early in the year. It is our largest revenue stream and it comes in frequently. And so through August, we've collected around $366 million in wage tax compared to $360 million in the first 2 months of FY20. So nothing particularly to worry about yet. But our next two largest tax streams, the BERT and the real estate, we don't see those until the spring. And so as Rob mentioned, we're still sorting out what credits there are from the BERT, the late payment, how much is going to accrue back to FY20. So right now, the numbers actually look deceptively good year over year because of that BERT deadline extension, but really those are going to accrue back to FY20. And so when you back that out, things are generally still looking good, but it's still very early. We'll feel more comfortable once we've got a quarter's worth and obviously just continue to monitor closely through the rest of the year. But waiting for the first quarter to close, I think will be the first real milestone where we feel, we can know what we're really looking at and working with.
Yep. And one of the big unknowns that goes back to something that Councilwoman Gimm asked of Harvey is if people who don't live in the city are working from home, will they be taking credits later? And if that happens, that could be a hit to our wage tax numbers. And we just won't know that for a little while.
So at this point in time, do you have any idea with that BERT number that seems so high that was reported, how much of that was for 20 versus 21?
It's really all 20. So the deadline was extended to July 15th. So yeah, that BERT number is an FY20 number. For FY20, it came in to a little better than we thought, but we won't see the FY21 number. I think Marissa mentioned this until the spring.
Okay. And then you just talked about this other question I wanted to ask you about the wage tax revenue. It was holding pretty steady. It looked like it was down 2% or so from last year. But over 40%, I believe, of our wage tax revenue comes from people who live outside the city. And so do we have any sense of what portion of that fiscal year 21 non-resident wage tax revenue might be subject to refunding because people are working from home? And how we factor that potential for refunds into our revenue estimates?
So what we did when we were crafting our revenue estimates for FY21 and beyond, is that we looked at, one, the chunk that is non-resident. We tried to understand what different sectors there were, how much of that, which ones were more susceptible for teleworking, which ones weren't. We worked with our outside economist, IHS Market, to identify how much we thought would shift. And that's how we then got that into our blended overall reduction that we're expecting for the wage tax. And one of the things we did in the 5-year plan was also build some of that in as permanent, that we are concerned that even if the public health crisis abates, even if the economy returns, some of that shift as people have just gotten accustomed to new ways of working will be permanent. And so as Rob said, fall pumpkin spice latte season isn't really when we'll know. We'll have to wait till we're in the spring and rejuvenation as we're looking at how folks are requesting those refunds. So unfortunately, it's one of those we're not really going to know until we know, but we think we've been appropriately conservative in our revenue estimates, that we built in some buffer for that, even though we won't have any real data until much later in the year, later in the fiscal year.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question. It's a little technical. What's the relationship between the cash flow projections in the 5-year plan and the monthly obligation and revenue reporting we've been receiving, and how can we on council or the public generally use public information to compare the monthly revenue reports with monthly revenue expectations?
Yeah, so it is a technical question. The obligations reports that you see and the 5-year plan projection numbers are based on a modified accrual basis of accounting. So the BERT is a perfect example. So that were for taxes that were due in FY20. So they were actually paid in July, which is the start of FY21, but will be counted as FY20 revenues. So from an accrual basis, they show in FY20. On a cash basis, they show in FY21. So there's kind of a big chunk right there. So I think what we need to do, to your point, is kind of explain what those big differences are between accrual and cash. And it's complicated early in the year when, to the discussion we were having before, if departments are entering their contracts, so you see those big obligation numbers, that's not cash going out. That's just an obligation because they've entered into the contract. So on the accrual basis, you're going to see that money has been obligated. On a cash basis, it won't have gone out. So they are really kind of apples and oranges in a way.
It's hard to that's hard to decipher and understand that information, especially for the public, but I hear you. Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much. I know we have questions from our colleagues, and I'd like to call upon Councilmember Bobby Heenan. Good morning, Councilman Heenan. I know you have a question.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this meeting today and in the past. We do appreciate that and rely on your expertise. Good morning, Mr. DeBoe. First, when you talk about obligations, I do feel obligated to thank you and your team and the entire recovery office for guiding us, advising us, and shepherding us through these difficult times, and hopefully, explaining it a little to the general public and to myself in a little bit layman's terms, how we're going to get through and how the city's going to survive. You're doing the yeoman's work, so I appreciate that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, I'm going to start off, recognizing the lead question that our chairman had asked, and regarding to real change since we did the budget, with the $750 million deficit, and then fast forward to having our principal hearing on fiscal oversight in July 28th. Since that meeting, have we had any significant changes, to now, to present, and knowing that our final numbers won't be in until October? So that's what we get into.
In FY21. So at that point, we'll have had a full quarter of revenues and expenditures and performance data. And we'll have had a little time after the end of the quarter to work through the numbers. And then we'll put out that report in November. So that'll be the two big reports over the next couple of months.
All right, I think we all look forward to that. And Mr. Chairman, I think there's another good opportunity for us to, digest, some of those findings in both of the reports. Another question, PICA, Mr. Rice had reported in his presentation that the FY 2020 fourth quarter report, the obligations increased by $61.9 million. So my question is that due to COVID contracts, possibly contract one-year contracts extensions? And if it is COVID, is it covered through midterm transfers or a budget, and or are we going to get reimbursed?
Yeah. Okay. So most of that increase is COVID related. And it was either in the spending was either under the appropriations in the transfer ordinance that the council passed early on in the pandemic, or departments were able to manage some of it by redirecting appropriations in their budget for these substantially new uses. And most of those costs should be reimbursable. And I don't know, Marissa, Sarah, or Chris, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well,
I don't think that.
I take it what you're saying is absolutely is true. So I mean, I appreciate your answer. And unless Marissa has anything to add, to end on that question, the midterm transfer that we had, and I know you're on course on spending for our end of year, the COVID relief. Has that midterm transfer, has that been fully spent and accountable for? Have you reported that?
So Marissa can talk more about. So we gave council reports. I think was it every other week, Marissa? We gave reports on how that money was being spent. We did that through the end of last fiscal year.
Yeah, we provided biweekly reports to council and then posted them online because we had the mid-year transfer ordinance was for $85 million. Just to make sure we had enough room to do what we needed to do, we had budgeted a certain amount of the CARES Act because it fell across 2 fiscal years. The first $100 million was budgeted for FY20. The second $176 million is in the grants fund for FY21. And what we did was just try and show how those were being utilized over the course of time. They did sort of happen in chunks, particularly as departments were, they would be getting costs, and then we transferred them to the MDO where we had parked all of that money, because it was very hard that early on to figure out, how much was, DHS going to need to spend on extra cleaning versus how much, in some of the public safety departments and things like that. And so that through that process, we reported on that FY20 transfer ordinance of $85 million, what had been spent against it over that period of time. And then I think Chris and Sarah will be talking about, beyond just that limited transfer ordinance, what things are looking at writ large for, as Rob mentioned, the over 20 grants and over $600 million we have received. So that'll be a different sort of configuration of information.
It's incredibly complicated. So thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Heaton. I'd like to call upon Councilmember Derek Green.
To advance the financial benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are multitasking in this COVID world. My question to Mr. DeBow is in reference to the COVID situation is both a global pandemic from a healthcare perspective and also an economic crisis that's really crippled businesses, especially small businesses in our city. To date, can you state for the record the amount of money that the administration has spent on assistance to small businesses to help them with their economic recovery during COVID?
Yeah, give me a second to find that.
Rob,
you have it?
Yeah. So what I can share is to date, the city, the state, PIDC, and philanthropy together allocated.
If you could focus on the city, not so much the state or philanthropy, just what the city has spent.
Okay, and that it'll take me another minute to get. I know together it's 50 million.
So I have it. The city amount so far has been 7.5 million.
Right. That's what I thought I saw in your presentation. And I guess my question and concern is, there's been other works. I know that, the Commerce Department, as well as under current leadership of Interim Commerce Director Sylvia Guy Howard and Nevins and Bovair Nevins, PIDC have also been trying to raise dollars for the private sector to help in this regard. But, we have the ability to provide some additional dollars to help small businesses. And that this is a follow-up to my question that I asked earlier regarding some of the policy concerns that we do have to spend CARES dollars by the end of this year. And in Mr. Bell, in your testimony, you talked about our ability to do that. My concern is our collar counties have been doing that recently, and actually in the presentation, how the state has provided about $225 million for assistance for small businesses around the Commonwealth. The city receives about $20 million. When you look at other counties, like Montgomery County, they've used CARES dollars to allocate about $10 million to businesses in their county. We've only spent $7 million. That did not come from CARES dollars. My question is, if we go into this fall and see how businesses are so struggling, what's going to be the commitment of the administration to use CARES dollars for economic recovery for our small businesses?
Yeah, and one of our priorities for the use of the CARES money is to use it for small businesses. We kind of understand all the constraints you're talking about, and we know that we have to act quickly. So that is something that we're focusing on. It's one of our high priorities, and we will be doing something with that soon.
I guess my question is, considering that when we first did the $85 million transfer ordinance and, the Commerce Department and PIDC rolled out the loan and grant program, we saw the oversubscription of that program and a significant amount of people that applied for that. And that was even before the payroll protection program came out, or the first round of state dollars came out, before Senator Hughes took his effort to identify these additional grant dollars. So we know, just based on people who applied for assistance from the city in the beginning of COVID, the need. We're now into September, and it's curious that we have not started to roll out those dollars when Montgomery County has spent $10 million in CARES dollars, and we haven't spent any for small business.
So, yeah, we know there's a great demand for the program, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that there are thousands of small businesses that have applied and are still waiting to see where they can be funded. And we know we won't be able to meet all of that need alone, but we are looking at ways to see what we can do, and we're going to really act on this quickly.
But how are we going to really act on this quickly when other counties have already allocated and got the money out, and we haven't done anything with our
I'm talking about going forward. We will be acting on it quickly.
Going forward, but we know a number of businesses who demanded or just needed money at the very beginning of this pandemic, and we provided what we did with general fund dollars based on the money that City Council allocated and some of the dollars that the Commerce Department was able to allocate. But why has there not been an urgency when we know this has been a crippling impact on our small businesses, many who couldn't go after the payroll protection program dollars because there are commercial partners like barbershops or beauty salons or small restaurants.
So
I just don't
I'm
see
agreeing with
urgency.
you that there's an area where we need to do more, and I'm telling you we're going to move on it quickly. And one of the processes we had to go through was to kind of look at the spending for things like when we set up the Surge Hospital. We had to kind of ensure that there would be additional funding when we got through all of that to allocate to things like rental assistance, which we've just done, and more for small business assistance. But we will be doing that, and we'll be doing it very quickly.
Okay. Well, I'm going to close because I know other colleagues have other questions. This is going to be an issue in next week's hearing as we talk about these issues on September 30th. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. I just want to chime in for a minute. I totally agree with Councilmember Green on this issue, and maybe we need to revisit this and look at it in a different light. And it's not spending. We're really investing in small businesses, and we're investing in our corridors, and not just in their businesses, but all the people they employ and all the tax revenue that they provide for us. So we're almost there. We're their partners. Their success is ours. So we need to maybe ramp it up, but view it as an investment. Even if we have to, I'd be in favor if we had to even borrow money to help these businesses. We should look at the payback. I'm sure it's worth it, especially at the interest rates of today. But you can't let these businesses not survive. We need the business to survive and the jobs that they generate. So I just wanted to share that and like to call upon Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. And I also echo the sentiments of my colleagues, Council Members Dom and Green, relative to our need to continue to invest in small businesses from a city perspective. So I just wanted to mention that first and foremost. I have a quick question around our preparation for the new budget season. Mr. Chairman, in February, we had a hearing in this committee around our own preparedness for an economic recession. And in that hearing, I'd asked about any cost savings that we have realized based on the city moving towards a program-based budgeting model, because typically you see savings in the third year. Knowing that we had a significant deficit in the FY20 budget due to COVID, has there been any consideration around moving towards a zero-based budgeting model where we can really analyze every function in city government for its needs and costs? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm gonna ask Marissa to answer that question.
Sure, and thank you, Councilwoman, because I think how we budget is so important to what outcomes we actually achieve, and I thank you for raising that question. And there's a lot of different models out there. Are we just looking at last year and adding some, which honestly is the simplest, most streamlined, takes the least amount of work so that you can revert to other things. We've got program-based budgeting where we really try and link the outcomes or metrics related to various programs to the spending. Zero-based budgeting is really saying, okay, let's start from scratch every year. Let's totally rethink everything that we do, figure out how much it's going to cost. There is no city or state that does like the theoretical zero-based budgeting where they just every year start from scratch. It'd be like if in your household budget, you're like, all right, my mortgage was this, but maybe we should move and do this. No, you start with a base.
Marissa, really quickly though, isn't this something that was successfully implemented in Montgomery County some time ago? And I just ask because we know that we are going to face significant budgetary challenges moving forward, although we may not know what it will be exactly. So this is something that has been implemented in a jurisdiction that is close to Philadelphia. So I want to be very clear about that. So again, going back to my point, is it something, though, that is a possibility that we should consider this year?
So, and I think there's a difference, I think, between like what you see in textbooks and what's on the ground and what has happened in Montgomery County. And actually, in part, what we started to do last year is that even though when we started the FY21 budget process, things were going great, but we still asked departments to come up with cut scenarios. What would they reduce if they had to? And not because at that time we thought that was really necessary, but it is that important interrogation of, let's sort of put everything on the table and think about it. And that served us well in a couple of different ways. Number one, it meant that we were ahead of the curve when actually the unthinkable and the unexpected happened, and that we already had a well of pre-vetted and thought out ideas. Unfortunately, they still weren't at the scale of what we faced as a result of COVID. But going through that process of asking for what we call cut scenarios, which we begin to build in, not just when things are already bad, but always, gives us the opportunity to then ask questions as we go through the budget process for individual departments that both will have requests for new funding as well as these cut scenarios. And really the question we ask, which is sort of zero-based budgeting-esque, is, well, you've said you want to invest money over here to achieve X. And you've also said that, you know, the first thing that you would reduce spending on is Y. Would you actually be, you know, if there's zero additional money, would you trade X for Y? Would you do that? And so I think that there are ways that we bring the principles of zero-based budgeting into what we're doing as we evolve and ask more questions throughout our budget. And unfortunately, as we went through COVID, we also had to really ask the questions, not just, you know, we didn't start with the assumption that we would just do 5, 10, 15, 20% less of everything we currently do. We really asked the questions of, are there some lines of service? Are there some activities that the city simply cannot do? And are there other areas that was important for us to preserve more fully? And so we had to make some very painful conversations where we thought about whole services that wouldn't continue to happen in part, and we tried to match up which were ones where the state or federal dollars would be able to step in, where philanthropy would fit in. And it was really important to us to vet those conversations through a couple of different lenses. By standing up a budget equity committee and using a racial equity lens, we were trying to be thoughtful about who was impacted by those decisions. We also wanted to be really thoughtful about what things might be able to be stood back up more quickly if federal dollars came through, if there was flexibility to use federal funds to replace our revenues. So we wanted to make sure that we were thinking on a couple of different trajectories, but certainly the intent of zero-based budgeting, where it's you look down and say, should we really be doing this? Is this a service that we should be providing? Should we be providing it in this way? And as a result, with this set of cost structures, is something that we're increasingly building into our budget process. I think that to go to a full, like what you see in the textbooks of zero-based budgeting, where you start from scratch each year, unfortunately takes so much capacity that we have to divert resources away from service delivery. But what we can do is sort of do that in more targeted ways each year and more on a rolling basis, which I think is more helpful. You know, there are certain things that don't need year in, year out looking at, are we going to do this the same way? But there are other areas that I think are certainly ripe for that. But you also want to make sure you're giving programs enough time to mature, that if everything is sort of swept off the table each year, we know that a lot of our programs take a couple of years to ramp up, to show impact. And so that's one of the things we also are increasingly trying to build into our decisions about investing in new areas is the evaluation piece. What are we getting? And having that. So there's a lot of different pieces. I think the ethos of zero-based budgeting is really in there to do that interrogation of what are we doing? How are we doing it? Really important.
No, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just quickly wanted to respond to Marissa. So my concern, though, is that I think we were in a great financial position, obviously, before COVID. My concern, though, is that we are at a point where we should be able to realize and or see what the actual savings are based on us moving to the program-based budgeting model, but also figuring out how we look at our budget moving forward in a different way. And I apologize, we're on virtual school. Okay, so how do we look at our budget in a different way so that we can really achieve and realize those savings?
Yes. So I think a lot of what the questions are is what are we getting? The bang for our buck. And by now having these measures attached to all mayoral agencies, and most of the independent elected offices have also moved into program-based budgeting, most of them. And it really lets you ask those questions. And unfortunately for Philadelphia, it's not just a question about savings. We were still in the process of restoring funding for services we lost in the last recession, but it's about being able to make those connections about what service level in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, do we want to be providing? And then what is the cost of that? And so in some areas, we might look and say, you know what, we're actually providing more in terms of quality or quantity than we think that Philadelphians want. We might be able to dial that back. In other areas, you look at these measures, and the budget office collects over 500 of those. They're all in the 5-year plan, a subset that makes sense to look at quarterly or in those quarterly city managers reports. So that the information's there is that you can begin to say, well, here's where we've generally been falling short. Is that an area that we actually want to invest more in or do things differently? And it lets us ask those questions. I don't think it's simply a matter of we have program-based budgeting and you get savings as a result, because unfortunately we're still a city with tremendous need and unmet needs in terms of, individuals, in terms of the services they want from Philadelphians. But it gives us the tools to really evaluate that connection between, what are the results and what are the impacts on a community level and what are we spending to get it? And it lets you occasionally see things and say, oh, we are spending a lot of money to get something that people don't actually care about. That's when you can say, oh, there's savings. But there's also going to be a lot of areas where you say, we are not delivering what Philadelphians deserve. We're spending this much. Could we spend it differently? Do we need to spend more in order to get Philadelphians what they need? So I think these are tools that let us have these conversations, but they don't necessarily automatically yield savings or automatically require additional funding, but they let us have these kinds of conversations. And we'll do this next budget season around what do we want for the money we're spending? Everybody says, budgets are sort of a reflection of the values and priorities of a community. So are we seeing that, or do we need to relook at that and look at those measures, look at the decisions we've made about what is funded and what's not, and change it? And that's really what this budget process is for, and why we want to make it a more inclusive conversation that reflects more points of view, particularly Black and Brown Philadelphians that maybe haven't had the chance to influence this process before, so that we can think about, are we doing the right, the right things? And I think that's we're excited to continue to broaden that conversation as we go into our planning for FY22.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely follow up with you on that, because budgets are moral documents and they should reflect the priorities that we intend to focus on, particularly in the next fiscal year. And really quickly, one last question I had was around if COVID-19 affected our ability to make any of our debt and or pension payments, or just any information there that we can share.
It has not. We've made all our debt service payments and all our pension payments.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I just want to echo your thoughts here, and that is that I know that in the business world today, more and more businesses are utilizing technology more dramatically coming out of this pandemic to cut overhead and save costs. And I guess that goes in line with the zero-based budgeting. How do we take advantage of that as a city government to really ramp up our technology to save efficiency, make it more efficient, and also save dollars? So that's not for today, but that's just something I just wanted to put out there. So our next question will come from our majority leader, Councilmember Sherelle Parker.
Thank you so much, Chairman Dom. I appreciate your leadership in helping to pull this very important hearing together. Rob DeBoe, I want you to know, if you would have answered and gave an answer any other than what you gave to Councilwoman Catherine Gilmore Richardson relative to those pension payments and that debt service, I would have reached through this screen and touched you on your shoulder. If it
you would have hunted me down. I know that.
So thank you so much. Let me just start by saying, one, Councilman Derek Green, Councilman Dom, Councilwoman Catherine Gilmore Richardson, Johnny on the spot. I agree with them wholeheartedly. And obviously, I've spoken to you directly and other members of the administration regarding the supports for small businesses, particularly those neighborhood businesses. But I do want to say this for the record. When we think about our regional economy, Council President Darrell Clark's thinking is in my mind. All of us, although we're one regional economy, we are not monolithic. We've done everything as it relates to responding to COVID in varying degrees. So who and when it was decided that each of those respective counties could move from red to yellow to green, they differed no matter where you are. So we all didn't move lock, stop, and step in the same direction at the same time, because we were dealing with some issues that they didn't have as strongly as we did in Philadelphia, particularly as it related to the civil unrest and the disproportionate number of Black and brown people who have been impacted by COVID. And now, Rob, I'm speaking specifically relative to those dollars when we talk about those CARES dollars and the dollars that have been invested in small businesses. So I want to start where I heard you leave off with Councilmember Green. I want to be very intentional about what we talk about moving forward. We know that there is a deadline. We have to get these dollars spent. We watched our Commerce Department stand up every program that we have in existence now to support them, and they did a yeoman's job in making that happen. But as we move forward, because there are such grand time constraints, I want to be very specific in making an ask that the Commerce Department partners with CDFIs. They have the capacity. They are working with small businesses right now. We are under the gun from a time perspective. And so I want to very specifically ask that we employ the use of their services to drive some of these dollars to the small businesses. Did demand, outweigh, what we had in the pot? Of course, even before we got started, that was in fact the case. And we all want to maximize the efficient use of scarce resources during this time. I just want to say I want the city to be strategic in making sure that the partners we select, or if, some folks I know are against, I will say for the record, us using partners. They think we should be able to just drive the dollars out ourselves. But I think we would do ourselves a disservice by not engaging the support of our area CDFIs. And so comment to me, if you will, whether or not you think that will be an option, since you readily admit it. And I appreciate it hearing you say we're talking about moving forward instead of rehashing what we've done, but what we're going to do to support this community moving forward and how we're going to get there. Are you or the administration adverse to using external partners to help us drive these dollars out?
I am not. I will also talk to the Commerce Director, but I don't think we're adverse to that.
Okay, so I'll be really looking forward to hearing what that dollar amount will be. I heard about the $10 million from Montco, but I don't care. In all of our 5-county area, I would argue that the businesses in the city of Philadelphia have been uniquely situated. All of the businesses needed support, but our small businesses, they are more than just essential. They are the lifebloods of our neighborhood, and I'm confident that our city will meet the moment to support what was referenced earlier, and I've been talking about since we've been dealing with COVID, and that is the yeoman's job that State Senator Vincent Hughes did with securing that historic $225 million. We've never seen anything like that before, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but it is definitely not enough. So I'm going to be looking forward to seeing what the city's response is going to be to support them. In addition to that, I wanted to just state this for the record, because, it is easy, for folk to sort of come on the back end to talk about what needs to be done, and we need to do it. Councilman Dom, Derek Green, Council President Gilmore Richardson, all of my colleagues, Squilla, everybody who is on this, we've all been trying to come up with the most innovative, the most strategic, the most economically efficient proposals or recommendations that we can make to just move Philadelphia in the right direction. Since the feds, every time we turn around, they've been moving the goalposts. We can't do this, but then they change the regs. We can do this, and then they change the regs, and then somebody says they spent it this way over here. So it's just a matter of interpretation about how Philadelphia can spend this money without the direct and concise leadership that we needed coming from the executive branch in Washington, D.C. I think that this council, working in conjunction with this administration, I think we've done, what we could, and I think we continue to try to get even better and to do so much more. So if Sarah, I don't know if Sarah DeWolf is listening, and Chris, I want to say to our Matt Stitt and all members of our technical team, want to thank you all so very much for the work you've done, particularly relative to this recovery office. I know your work hasn't been easy. Again, the feds keep moving the goalposts, and the decisions have been tough, but we just got to keep moving in the right direction. And the first direction for me, Rob and Marissa, I'm going to be watching very carefully, because whatever we're going to send to small businesses, we better make sure it's grand, and we should be able to scale it, and we should make sure we have partners that can help us get this out effectively and efficiently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Majority Leader Parker. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, but I have one or two questions for, I guess, could be the city treasurer, Christian Dunbar. So here's the question. First, Mr. Dunbar, I'd like to thank you and your office for the great work you do and how responsive you've been to our office on questions and requests since you came on board. So doing a great job. Thank you. And the latest report we received on the reconciliation of the city's bank accounts shows that we still need to reconcile, I guess, March through June of our FY20 payroll account. And I'm guessing that payroll reconciliation is a little more complicated than usual because of the pandemic. Any idea what you're anticipating, how long it'll take to reconcile the city accounts for fiscal year 20? And will that have any effect on our eligibility for recovery funding?
We don't anticipate that it will have any effect on our recovery. We are working with our accountants, and just to give you a quick snapshot, as we were dealing with the pandemic, as you know, we all went out of the office around March 18th, and working with OIT, our accounting staff was only about 50% in terms of being able to work remotely till about July. And so what we had to do was prioritize the type of accounts that we wanted to ensure was reconciled and looked at on a daily and or weekly basis, and we did that based on really the potential of fraud or risk to the city. Some of the other accounts that were, took a bit longer would have been the employee payroll and the levy, because those accounts from a fraud perspective are relatively lower. Now that our accounting staff is up and fully running, we are going through the process right now to ensure that we can catch up that payroll, the employee payroll account. And again, just to reiterate, we don't expect that to have any effect on our ability for any of the recovery dollars. And I'm waiting for an update from our accounting team, who should have that for me within the next week or two. We're expected to be completely up and running, to be quite honest, by the end of next month, in terms of all of our accounts.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And keep up that great work. I have a second question for you. And it goes around what I call, I guess, refinancing. And for the public benefit, interest rates today are so low. Anyone who owns a row home or home in the city should be probably looking at refinancing, because they could be as low as 2.5% right now for a 30-year mortgage. So I know the Federal Reserve has been a leader in providing recovery funding through capital markets. Mm-hmm. And back during the budget process, we decided the municipal financing vehicle they offered didn't make financial sense, I believe, for us to take advantage of. Mm-hmm. Have there been any opportunities in the first quarter of this fiscal year, with rates so low, to find some support through capital markets? And can we realize some savings here on interest costs for future bond refundings that might be available now? Those rates are, so low at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Our most recent transaction, just to give you a sense, to your point, how low rates are, the municipal liquidity facility and the rates that they offer would have been roughly about 2.1%, but we were able to borrow our TRAN, and that's a short-term borrowing, for 26 basis points, just to give you a sense of really how low rates are. We are, as you know, Councilman, constantly reviewing our entire debt portfolio, and that's across all of our agencies, which is roughly just under $9 billion for refunding opportunities. We just did a significant refinancing with our water department. And we saw, tens of millions of dollars worth of savings there. We're in the process of refinancing our gas works, and there aren't many general obligation bonds that are at a stage where we can refinance them now. And there are sort of technical reasons around why we can't do that. We can only do it taxably if we want to do advance refunding. And advance refunding is just essentially refunding something before the call date. Every time we issue bonds, we typically can't call those bonds or refund those bonds for 10 years. And so that gives us some limitation. In 2017, what happened is that we, tax exempt advance refinancing, which would allow us to refinance a bond prior to that 10-year tax call date, was removed in a 2017 tax proposal that passed Congress. And so we can do that taxably, but obviously taxable rates are higher than tax exempt rates. And so we're always evaluating there's opportunity costs when you refinance too quickly. Where if you waited a year or two, you may be able to refinance at a much better saving to the city. And so what we call that is optionality. As we review our portfolio, and we're always looking at a number of different things. Obviously, how much money we're going to save. There's negative ARB, and I won't go through those technicals, but also optionality, where we may be able to wait a bit longer before we do a refinance, and that would be in the long-term best interest of the city, because many of these bonds are out 20 and 30 years, and in some cases out even 35 years. So we're always reevaluating that our proposal on a pretty monthly basis to try to take advantage of refinancing opportunities.
Thank you. Is the holdup basically that you just can't refinance some of these bonds, or the penalties are so great that the economics don't work?
So some of it is the economics, again, negative ARB, and that's just what we may call opportunity cost in refinancing. Because anytime you refinance, what you really end up doing, unlike a mortgage refinancing where you're taking out that debt completely, what we're doing is we're refinancing and we're taking money and we're putting it in an investment fund, and that investment fund will then pay back the bonds for us. So it's not a true refinancing as we think about from a mortgage perspective, because those bonds stay out to the investors because there's limitations on the call date, which is typically about 10 years. And we are looking at different financing structures, maybe a shorter call date or other financing structures that might make sense for the city long term. But as it relates to our portfolio, over the last 4 years, we have done a significant number of refinancing. And so that's why many of our call dates are out past 10 years. And so we don't have many current callable bonds. And so because, again, tax-exempt advanced refinancings have gone away, we can only look at taxable. And we want to be very careful how we go about refinancing taxably, because those rates are typically higher than tax-exempt rates.
All right, well, that sounds great. I just want to stress that this is such a big area right now where we could save money. Whatever we can do to help you, get you the tools you need, just let us know, because this is an area where with low interest rates, what other businesses around the world are doing, they're refinancing almost all their debt to lower their cost of doing business. And we should, and it sounds like we should do the same thing as the city of Philadelphia. So I appreciate everything you're doing, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your leadership on some of these issues.
Thank you. So now I'd like to call upon, Sarah DeWolf and Chris Roop to give us their recovery office report.
Thank you, Councilman. Chris, are you there?
I am, but my camera does not want to work right now.
Okay.
Give me just 1 second. Let me try to figure it out.
Remember to state your names for the record there.
Sure. I'm Sarah DeWolf, Deputy Finance Director and co-recovery lead for the City of Philadelphia.
And I'm Chris Roop, Deputy Managing Director for Policy and Legislation and co-recovery lead. Thank you for having us today.
Good morning. Thank you.
In the interest of everybody's time, we'd like to give an abbreviated slide deck. If you don't mind, I think the copy was distributed to all members, but if that works for you, Mr. Chair.
Perfect.
Great. And we'll also make this available on our website at some point too. And we're happy to we're happy to answer any questions that we may not cover in any of the specific slides. So, Sarah, maybe if we could skip ahead to the second slide.
Sure.
In this presentation, we'll give a high-level and brief overview of the work that's underway, the impact of COVID-19 that's had on the city, and some of the challenges we faced when responding to the pandemic. We'll also provide some clear examples of how the federal dollars the city has received have been deployed to help Philadelphians who are suffering the most from the effects of COVID-19. We'll go over a high level, the overall strategy that has guided our deployment of resources and how the city's focus on equity has influenced the city's response. We'll also preview what we'll be working on in the months ahead. The city will be releasing a public report on these topics in the very near future. So today we wanted to preview some of the content that will be included in that report. I'd also like to mention that just a few days ago, the Census Bureau released data on poverty, and it indicated that Philadelphia's poverty rate has declined from 28.4% in 2011 down to 23.3% in 2019. Again, that's a decline from 28.4 in 2011 to 23.3 in 2019. Philadelphia was moving on the right track until COVID hit. We need to make sure we continue that progress as we recover from this pandemic, and that goal has driven a lot of the city's response activities aimed at mitigating economic insecurity and hardship, and has also shaped our continued advocacy for additional federal relief. And Sarah, could we skip down to slide 8?
Yep.
Right. So just some high-level talking points about the impact of COVID-19's had on the city. We all know that COVID has had a very significant impact. As of Monday, our city has recorded 35,825 confirmed cases and 1,785 deaths. We were one of the earliest places in the U.S. to be impacted by COVID-19, and the city responded quickly and aggressively to mitigate it. Public health guidelines require certain restrictions on economic activity to slow the spread of the disease and flatten that curve. And from a public health perspective, we've been largely successful. However, these restrictions also cause dramatic and racially inequitable economic harm. In July, Philadelphia's unemployment rate exceeded 19%. Furthermore, the city's tax structure makes it particularly vulnerable to sudden economic volatility. Unlike many other counties and cities, including the counties in our surrounding area, we rely heavily on taxes that are particularly sensitive to economic fluctuations. As a result of this, the city is projected to have a $749 million revenue shortfall this fiscal year, which for some context is an impact roughly 7 times greater than the revenue gap during the Great Recession. I'm going to fly through a couple quick slides here and not spend a lot of time on either one, but I wanted to make sure you had a chance to see them because I thought they did a nice job kind of demonstrating the impact in a visual way that the pandemic has had on our city. Here we can see that the number of positive tests has decreased after that initial spike in the spring. This occurred despite the significant increase in the number of tests being performed. In other words, we've tested more people, and both the number and percentage of positive test results have steadily declined. Some officials may claim that higher positive test results are due to more testing activity. And here in Philadelphia, the data simply does not support that argument. This graph shows the number of new and continued unemployment claims filed by Philadelphians. The 2 dark lines add up to the orange line on top. You can see that we saw a spike in new unemployment claims filed in April. And since May, the total number of Philadelphians claiming UC benefits has started to trend downward. However, claims remain about 5 times higher than they were before the pandemic, which you can see by comparing the far right side of the chart to the far left side. This data indicates that unemployment has disproportionately hurt younger, less educated workers, as well as racial minorities. According to Philadelphia Works, approximately 210,000 total UC claims were filed by Philadelphians between March 15th and August 1st. Almost 70% of those UC claimants reported an educational attainment level below a high school diploma or GED. These 2 tables break out the UC claimant characteristics further. On the left, you can see that UC claimants are disproportionately minority compared to the characteristics of the labor force overall. On the right, you can see that the age cohort with the most UC claims is those between 25 and 34. And those with the lowest level of educational attainment represent the majority of claimants in every age group. So in summary, Philadelphia is facing significant fiscal challenges due to the pandemic, but we're not alone. Most large cities and states are facing similar challenges due to the sudden and severe loss of tax revenue. At the same time, cities and states are facing increased costs associated with responding to the pandemic. We're also facing some very significant impacts related to unemployment, and the impacts have hit the hardest on those who are least educated, racial minorities, and younger workers. We're very thankful that Congress has provided significant funding to help us respond to the pandemic, but these funding streams all have various restrictions and typically can't be used to make up for lost tax revenue. We have joined many of our peer cities and membership organizations to advocate for additional direct and flexible funding to help us respond to the pandemic and manage through the related fiscal challenges. But Congress has not yet come to an agreement on this, and a future agreement does not seem imminent. Congress also thankfully provided some increased short-term financial support for families and individuals who have lost jobs or income due to COVID-19 in the form of enhanced unemployment benefits, but that has not provided long-term financial support for these people. And we really need more long-term financial support coming out of Washington in order to ensure a robust and successful recovery. And now I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will walk you through the next section.
Great, thanks, Chris. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this overview of federal legislation and just move into our next section. As we talk about the recovery funding that we've received to date, we wanted to share some of the challenges and constraints that we're facing with our recovery work. The next few slides will provide an overview of those challenges. So, while every grant comes with its own set of constraints, the biggest and the most flexible funding source that we've received so far is the Coronavirus Relief Fund payment from the U.S. Treasury that was created as part of the CARES Act. When the CARES Act was passed, Congress created a formula for the distribution of the $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Fund to states and local governments with populations of 500,000 or more. Through this formula, most of the funding went to state governments and not to cities or counties. Philadelphia, as a local government with a population of at least 500,000, received a share of Pennsylvania's total funding through the formula set by Congress, and that share was $276.4 million. That amount equates to slightly less than 6% of the total funding received by Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, as Rob talked about earlier, this allocation is not proportionate to either Philadelphia's population or to the number of COVID-19 cases that Philadelphia has experienced. Philadelphia is home to roughly 12% of Pennsylvania's population and over 20% of Pennsylvania's COVID cases, as we show on these charts. While we continue to advocate for additional flexible federal funding, discussions about another federal relief package have stalled. With no acceptable compromise in sight for Democrats and Republicans, it's looking unlikely that additional federal funding will be made available anytime soon, or that rules will change to allow more flexible use of our CRF funding. What this means is that for now, we will continue to face the two major constraints with respect to our CRF dollars. Namely, we cannot use them to replace lost revenue, which is the area where our finances have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and we must spend the entire allocation by December 30th, 2020. This deadline means that we'll face a steep drop-off in funding at the end of the calendar year, and we don't know what will happen with the pandemic between then and now or beyond. In addition to these constraints, the rules guiding how we may use our CRF funds have continued to evolve, making it harder to ensure compliance with the federal guidelines. As of this Monday, Treasury has issued and revised its guidance and FAQs governing eligible costs and necessary documentation 12 times. In addition, Treasury has implemented extremely cumbersome reporting requirements for the CRF, requirements that were only made available in full in early September. With limited funding available to Philadelphia, we want to make sure that programs enacted at the local level were informed by the state's decisions about how to spend its CRF dollars. However, lack of clarity has also existed at the state level. To date, Harrisburg has only allocated $2.6 billion of its $3.9 billion in CARE CRF funds, and it remains unclear how the Commonwealth will use its remaining funds. While we're grateful for the relief programs that the Commonwealth has implemented, we're still waiting to see what impact these programs have had and what the extent of unmet need looks like. In addition, many strings are attached to these funds that limit their effectiveness, such as capping rent relief at a value that's far below market rent in a city like Philadelphia. This slide shows the timeline for CRF guidance changes. As you can see, the rules governing how these dollars can be spent have been updated over and over again, making it difficult for governments to move money out the door quickly. Funding was distributed in late April, but funding recipients were only notified of reporting requirements in early July, 2 weeks before the first report was due, and guidance and Q&A documents have been revised as recently as this past Monday. We also wanted to share our reporting timelines with you. As you can see in this report, our first interim report on spending from March 1 through June 30th was submitted to the U.S. Treasury in mid-July. Another more detailed report on the same time frame is being prepared and will be submitted by October 5th. We're planning to issue a public update on recovery work around the time of this first full quarterly report. Our next quarterly report is due to Treasury not long after the first one on October 13th. As you can see in the chart, we're also planning to time another quarterly update to be issued shortly after the submission of that report. And in recognition of the need for more regular updates, we will also begin providing monthly updates on grants, activities, and spending to City Council beginning in October. Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk through the next section.
Thanks, Sarah. So as we noted earlier, the city is facing increased costs and decreased revenues, so we have minimal capacity for financial risk. We therefore need to try to do all we can to recover our costs for responding to the pandemic. But at the same time, there are a lot of urgent needs in the community that we need to address to ensure a successful recovery. These needs far exceed the city's resources. So we need to try to balance the need to meet the long-standing needs of our residents by providing the services they've always relied on, while also trying to meet the new and exacerbated needs due to COVID-19. And we must try to be able to do both in FY21 and beyond, because the overall economic recovery will be a longer-term effort than the federal dollars will last for. To try to accomplish this, we've intentionally tried to make sure we've identified areas where the state and federal government are providing support to avoid duplication of efforts or wasteful spending. And it's also helpful for us to understand where the gaps and unmet needs are, as well as the impact of various investments to ensure we're being efficient with our dollars. We are also focusing a lot of time and effort on ensuring that documentation is thorough and decisions are sound, so we minimize our risk at audit and keep as much of the federal funding as possible. This slide shows an update on our overall grant activity. At this point, the city has received a total of 24 grants totaling approximately $623 million. The largest portion of the funding is the CRF, which represents 44% of the total funds. Though the CRF has the most flexibility, each of these grants have restrictions of their own. For the CRF, those funds can only be used to cover expenses that are necessary due to the pandemic and public health emergency, were not accounted for in the most recent pre-pandemic budget, and the expenses must be incurred between March 1st and December 30th. The public report that the city will issue in the near future will break these grants out into more detail with respect to amounts, eligible uses, and time periods. This slide provides a high-level overview of how CRF funds have been spent as of June 30th. As Sarah mentioned, Treasury required the city to file an interim report on spending activity through June 30th over the summer, and required expenses to be categorized into specific themes and reported as lump sum totals. This slide summarizes what we reported at that time as preliminary numbers. From March 1st through June 30th, we reported eligible expenses totaling just under $116 million, or 41% of the total CRF funds. At this rate, we are on pace to spend down our CRF dollars by the December 30th deadline. The largest area of expense is payroll costs for public health and safety staff who are on the front lines of pandemic response. We also incurred sizable expenses due to medical and public health response activities, and some examples include the medical examiner surge capacity, PPE, and the Leah Center Medical Surge Site. We also dedicated $7.5 million for economic relief to small businesses and nonprofits through the first phase of the city's Small Business Relief Fund and the PHL COVID-19 Fund. Once this interim report was completed, Treasury substantially changed its reporting requirements going forward. We are currently in the midst of recategorizing this expense data by specific project and will have those numbers available by early October. Data for the first quarter of FY21 will then be available a little bit later in October in advance of that next Treasury reporting deadline. And this data will also be on a project-specific basis. So it will give you a little bit more insight, transparency, and clarity around the costs and attributing those to a specific activity, rather than just looking at a lump sum total or a list of purchase orders and encumbrance and actual data. And now I'll turn it back over to Sarah to walk you through the elements of the city strategy.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So the next few slides will focus on our reimbursement strategy. So with limited funding available for our response and recovery efforts, we've prioritized 3 key areas of spending: protecting public health and safety, protecting vulnerable residents, and recovering economically from the impacts of the pandemic. Within these themes, we're working to equitably distribute funds to cover new costs incurred by the city in its response to the pandemic, and to support new programs that provide direct and meaningful relief for those residents and businesses who have been hit hardest by this crisis. Since early March, city agencies have been on the front lines of the response to the public health crisis. As Council is well aware, these response efforts have required previously unbudgeted and unanticipated spending in a number of areas that are eligible for reimbursement through the CRF. From March 1st to June 30th, the city's general fund incurred more than $100 million of payroll, medical, and public health expenses resulting from our response to the pandemic. Specific line items have included personal protective equipment for essential city workers and the public, healthcare services and testing at the prisons to prevent the rapid spread of the disease within an enclosed area, other disease containment strategies, standing up an emergency operations center to coordinate amongst departments and partner agencies, establishing and overseeing a medical surge facility, communicating with the public and promoting healthy practices, cleaning and installing protective plexiglass barriers in public buildings, and establishing protocols to ensure the sustained provision of essential public services. In addition to the costs incurred related to protecting public health, several key investments have also been made to protect vulnerable populations from the impact of the pandemic. These include investing up to $46 million of local and state CARES Act funding in 2 phases of rental assistance. The first phase will serve up to 4,000 households, and the second phase will serve up to 6,300 households with a stacked benefit designed to encourage more participation from landlords and to maximize drawdown of state funds. In addition, recognizing that many households in Philadelphia are impacted by the digital divide and that having reliable internet access is essential to remote learning, we're also investing up to $3 million to provide Wi-Fi hotspots to K-12 households through the PHL Connected program, and are supporting access centers with Wi-Fi hotspots as well. We've also repurposed 3 hotels to provide isolation, quarantine, and prevention services to vulnerable residents who cannot safely shelter at home or in a congregate setting. To date, nearly 500 individuals have participated in the isolation quarantine program and over 200 in the COVID prevention spaces. And we have invested in food distribution to help those who may not be able to access more traditional service delivery methods due to health restrictions, as well as those who are encountering economic hardship due to COVID. To date, we have invested $6.2 million with 679,000 food boxes distributed and nearly 6 million meals served. In March, recognizing that many of Philadelphia's small businesses were impacted by the public health restrictions imposed to slow the spread of the virus, The city acted quickly and committed $7 million to the Small Business Relief Fund, which helped to leverage additional non-city funding. Through this fund, a total of $13.3 million was distributed to over 2,000 businesses for a mix of grants and zero-interest loans. 50% of the awardees were located in low to moderate income census tracts. In early June, the governor announced a $225 million small business grant program through the CDFI fund, funded with state CRF dollars. During the first phase of this grant program, over 1,100 Philadelphia businesses received a total of $20.4 million, with 70% of funds going to historically disadvantaged businesses. The city is awaiting full details on the impact and distribution of the remaining phases. The city also made an early contribution of $500,000 to the PHL COVID-19 fund. These funds help to leverage philanthropic contributions, which together have provided $17.5 million in grants to more than 500 nonprofits. Together, these various programs have allocated over $50 million to help small businesses and nonprofits impacted by the pandemic. This slide shows some additional statistics about the first small business relief program, including the makeup of businesses receiving grants, the type of industries receiving funding, and the applications by zip code. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Chris to talk about the importance of an equity-centered approach during our recovery.
Thanks, Sarah. As we noted previously, the pandemic disproportionately harmed low-income residents and communities of color. For us to have a successful recovery, we must ensure that assistance is targeted to those who have been harmed the most. In order to accomplish this, the city launched a series of initiatives that were designed to specifically reach those who are in greatest need. I'll provide a high-level overview of a few of these response strategies, which are being funded in whole or in part through CRF dollars. We would be happy to follow up with the subject matter experts who are closest to the actual operations of these activities to respond to any specific questions you may have. So we know from the unemployment data that racial minority groups are disproportionately shouldering the economic impacts of the pandemic. But testing data also shows they are bearing a disproportionate share of the health impacts as well. The data on the right side of these charts, which is from the health department, illustrates that the number of COVID-19 cases has disproportionately impacted African American and Hispanic residents the most, as well as older residents of all racial groups. So given how inequitable these impacts are, the health department has intentionally structured its response with an equity focus. The department hired a diverse staff of contact tracers in an effort to ensure that the staff have the cultural and linguistic competencies to successfully reach those who need to be reached the most. Testing efforts have also focused on trying to reach racial minorities. Here are some graphics illustrating the demographic breakouts and linguistic capabilities of this staff. Given how inequitable these impacts are, the health department the health department is also working with organizations who can expand community-based testing with a focus on underserved populations, because we know that there are barriers and biases in traditional healthcare delivery systems, so we need to make sure we are reaching people where they are using more trusted avenues. To date, 14 organizations have been funded, and the department continues to accept responses to its RFI for community-based testing. The first and largest grant was made to the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium, whose founder is also working with the health department to help shape its equity work and planning for flu and COVID vaccine deployment. Through the efforts of these community-based organizations and health department staff, testing has increased among minority populations, and African American Philadelphians now have the highest testing rate per capita. The city's equitable response to the impacts of the pandemic extended beyond targeted testing activity and also included ensuring that the basic foundational needs of our vulnerable residents could be addressed effectively. Here are a few more key examples of that. Many city departments and agencies came together to ensure that our residents who are at risk of food insecurity could be fed. In addition to the economic harm caused by the pandemic also impacted food supply chains and distribution systems. Traditional indoor feeding operations could not operate, and schools that typically provide free meals were closed. To respond, the city set up a network of food distribution sites as depicted on this map. These sites were clustered in the parts of the city with the highest need to try to ensure that those who need help can access it. Through this enormous effort, over 679,000 boxes of shelf-stable foods were distributed to families. More than 5.6 million meals were distributed to school-aged students, and more than 250,000 meals were served to unsheltered or economically insecure residents who could not access traditional meal sites due to health restrictions. More than 85,000 meals were also distributed to seniors who are often particularly at risk of COVID-19. Another major issue we tried to address was the long-standing digital inequities in our city. This digital divide became exacerbated by the shift to virtual learning for our public school students, many of whom are from low-income households where internet service is an unaffordable luxury. To ensure that kids can have reliable internet access and safe environments to learn in, the PHL Connected and Access Centers initiatives were launched. As of this week, there are now 77 access centers citywide where students can receive their instruction in a safe and supportive environment. The distribution of these sites is shown on this map. This work was an excellent collaboration with the school district and philanthropy, and the city invested approximately $3 million from the CRF to provide Wi-Fi hotspot devices to households that had public school children but no internet access, and to operationalize the access centers. Deploying resources with an equity focus is vitally important because we need to make sure those who need help the most are receiving the most help. However, equity and response must also extend beyond the deployment of services and into procurement practices. Departments have also worked to ensure that procurement activities related to the pandemic are equitable and inclusive. Due to the nature of the pandemic, many of the city's significant purchases were related to healthcare services, medical equipment, food, technology, and human services. A lot of very specialized things had to be acquired on an expedited basis and often with supply chain challenges. Federal guidelines also require us to follow a competitive process in most cases, and urgency can often force departments to use or amend existing contracts that already went through a competitive process. However, despite these unusual circumstances, the administration has stressed the importance of inclusive procurement. CAO has established an emergent contracting committee in partnership with law, procurement, and OEO to promote equity and diversity while also complying with the federal grant requirements. The group reviews COVID-related procurements and tries to identify areas to maximize participation. Preliminary spending data is shown on this slide through September 1st on all COVID-related contracts. You can see that for the total universe of for-profit procurements during this period, the city has achieved a 30% total MWDBE participation rate, 23% MBE participation, 5% WBE participation rate, and another percentage went to firms with multiple MWDBE categories. These numbers represent a snapshot in time and will be refined and updated as the books close on FY20 and spending obligation data continues to be updated as invoices are paid and goods and services are acquired. But we will continue to stress the importance of inclusive procurement throughout the pandemic response and recovery process, and we will continue to report out on this important metric. And now I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thanks, Chris. So before finishing up, Chris and I wanted to give a quick overview of upcoming recovery activities. As you know, the pandemic is far from over and the city is preparing for a potential increase in COVID cases this fall and winter. There will be additional costs associated with some of these preparations to ensure the city is positioned to withstand another surge in cases. In addition, we will continue to embed a racial equity approach into our programs and processes. We will continue to emphasize the city's MWDSBE goals and the importance of those goals for all spending, including federal and state dollars. We will also continue to evaluate our existing relief programs for renters and small businesses to ensure maximum impact and minimal gaps. This includes using our own dollars to leverage funding from state and philanthropic communities. We will continue to work closely with the school district to ensure that children and their families have what they need to learn safely and, where necessary, remotely. And we'll continue to advocate for additional flexible funding to offset our revenue losses while maximizing our drawdown of grant dollars and ensuring compliance with federal guidelines. So Chris and I want to thank you for the opportunity to present on this work. Our contact information and website is listed at the end of this presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Sarah and Chris, for the presentation. Excellent work. You guys seem like you're doing a really good job. I do have a few questions, and I'll open it up to my colleagues. I guess one of the concerns I have is I feel like we're not being treated fairly by the state. You know, we have the population, we represent 12%, and in all the different categories, like in one category we're getting 6% of the money, another category we're getting not even 8 or 9% of the money. It just doesn't seem fair, and I assume we have lobbyists that are working on this, but what are we doing to make sure we get at least our fair share? I'm not asking for more, even though we had way more COVID cases than any other place in the state of Pennsylvania. What are we doing to lobby the governor and the legislative body to make sure we get just our fair share?
Sure. So I could take that. We are in regular communication through the mayor's office with our lobbying firms that deal with both state and federal issues, as well as with our elected legislative delegation members. We have sent numerous letters outlining our priorities. We do have a very good working relationship with the administration in Harrisburg. I think some of these issues are very challenging because, whenever, every jurisdiction we found is facing a very different set of circumstances. And, when lawmakers in Washington are trying to strike a deal on how to allocate resources, oftentimes population is one of the only data points they have to go on. I think the unfortunate reality is that the way they crafted the formula distribution in the CARES Act, most of the money went to states. No state, regardless of its size, got less than $1.25 billion. And all of the large counties were then given a much smaller allocation based on their proportionate share of the population, based on like a tweak to the formula. So like our population share, that 12%, was only applied to 45% of the state's money. So we ended up with, a much, much smaller share than 12%. We are also facing challenges by the fact that we are both a city and a county. Many other counties do not have the level of frontline response activity dealing with public health and safety that we do. For example, we're the only county in Pennsylvania, to my knowledge, that runs an EMS system that serves the entire city. Many other counties are in a position where they are not bearing as many of the direct costs for responding and can sort of dole out grants and distribute funding to others to carry out the work. So, that's my long-winded way of saying that we engage on a very regular basis with our lobbyists and with our elected officials. We submit written testimony. We have submitted, advocacy letters. It just seems like, unfortunately, particularly in Washington, there's not a whole lot of urgency for people to come to the table and really make some tough choices.
Have we engaged the business community in Philadelphia to help us in this situation? Because we do generate a lot of taxes for the state of Pennsylvania from Philadelphia. And I wonder if we, called out 20 or 25 business leaders and say, hey, we need your help here. We need you to lobby for us to get at least our fair share.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And that work may be happening underway through the chamber and through the Commerce Department. Commerce may be better equipped to speak to the details of that. But and one other thing I wanted to mention, and I also wanted to call out Councilmember Green from his involvement with the National League of Cities, is that we're members of, the NLC, U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, and we are actively engaged with all of those organizations. It has become very clear to us very early on that regardless of what the specific impacts of the pandemic have been, many of us are all sharing the same concerns. And, we've really been in lockstep with our advocacy priorities across the country. It just, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of movement on the legislative side or progress on solving some of these really challenging issues to this point.
Okay, well, thank you. I have a few questions I'm going to ask regarding this. One is, are you both overseeing the consultant we hired to ensure we spend our money down by December 31st?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I hear from my colleagues, and I think maybe council needs and deserves maybe some assurances that we understand priorities as things progress and that this money will be spent effectively. And can we ask you to come back in a month to report out to this body and to the public? And can you give us an understanding for how the revenues and obligations will be reported out? And also, it sounds to me like, I could be wrong about this, is about $640 or $650 million in total funds. I guess one of my questions in very simple math is, how much of that have we spent so far? How much have we not spent so far? And, in the rental assistance program of those people affected by the virus, we need to help them as much as possible. And the small businesses, because those are the investments that will pay off in the long term. And we need to make sure they stay alive and don't go out because of this virus. Those are so valuable to us. So I'll let you answer those questions for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Chris. We're happy to come back and give an update. I think we will be in a good position in about a month to provide kind of a broader overview. One of the things we're working on is actually something stolen from our ERA days, which is a drawdown report just showing how we're spending down grant funds. So we're standing that up now. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of numbers crunching that has to happen behind the scenes with this data. But I think we'll be ready, and we're definitely working on extracting all that information from our systems.
And the only thing I'd add to what Sarah said is, as we're going through the process of reporting to Treasury on, the last quarter or last 4 months of FY20 and the first quarter of FY21, we're going to have much more precise expenditure data categorized sort of on a project by project basis to share with you very soon.
Is it possible to get a detailed expense account for each fund we've received that makes up the total 640, 650? And second part of this is, if I had to guess at a number of how much we've spent, have we spent of the 640, 300 million, 200 million? Just give me some ballpark so we know where we are.
Yeah, we can try to pull something like that together. I think every grant's going to be a little bit different because some of them we have not, we've received a notice of award, but we have not, and, gotten a budget approved, but we haven't actually had the money hit our account yet because it's on a reimbursement basis. And some of the other ones have a bit longer of a time horizon, but that's the kind of information we want to make sure we can get a good, robust grant drawdown report that we can share with you.
But if I were to ask you not to be difficult on this, I'm just trying to get an idea, like as of today, if we receive $640 to $650 million, have we spent 250, 300, 200? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, we can pull that together for you. The biggest question mark is in my mind right now is I don't have the latest numbers from Airport right at my fingertips, and they were the largest recipient other than the CRF of our city dollars, and their grants work on a different way than our CRF money does.
Okay, now that's an important number, I think, to share with the council, and so we understand where we are. I think it's a very important number.
I think, can I just add one other thing to that, which is that I think when we provide that number, I think one thing we need to do to contextualize it is that not all grants have the same sort of spending deadline. So we have several multi-year grants. So I just want to make sure that kind of also gets captured in what we're talking about.
That's fine. We've heard a lot of comments about rental housing assistance for COVID issues, and we've also heard about the small business. I think you're hearing from my colleagues and myself that whatever we can do to ramp those two areas up, we want to do, and especially these small businesses that are going out of business. We're losing jobs. We're losing. That's just it's an investment by us, and it's a smart investment for us to keep them alive. Here's my next question.
We agree.
Great. How much of our fiscal year 20 overtime was reimbursed by CARES money, and can you give us a breakdown of how much overtime is covered by different recovery-related reimbursements?
I'll be honest, I don't have that number right at my fingertips, but we can follow up with you and get that number for you.
And last question I have, then I'll open it up to my colleagues. Do you anticipate needing to come to council with an appropriations bill to move recovery set-asides in the grants revenue fund into specific departments?
Not at this time.
Yeah. I think not at this time. The way we've set up our funding, we're trying to, Marissa alluded to this earlier, but we're trying to kind of maintain centralized cost tracking. So we're doing less of sort of moving the money out and more moving the expenditures into a central location. But we'll definitely let you know if we need that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions by my colleagues? I don't see any in the chat room. Does anyone have any questions for our recovery team? You guys are doing a good job, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Seeing no further questions, I want to thank you for your testimony today and for the information you provided, and I look forward to receiving a lot of information from you. And I want to thank every witness today for being here. and for your ongoing oversight of our city's finances. And we hope to have you back real soon. And in accordance with today's agenda, I call for this committee to adjourn until 2:30 today. Thank you very much, and appreciate everybody's help. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Council Chair, we are now live.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This hearing is called to order, and I'd like to recognize Council members Isaiah Thomas and Council member Derek Green. And I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We're using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. I'd like to ask Ms. Burbach to call our first panel of this session. Thank you.
Tumar Alexander, Cynthia Figueroa, Ann Fajolin, and Sylvie Gallier-Howard.
You have this.
Good afternoon. I'm actually under the impression that it's should be
Yeah,
myself.
sorry, that was my mistake. Okay, so we're going to hear from Harvey Rice, Rob Jabot, Marissa Waxman, Commissioner Daniel Outlaw, Commissioner Adam Thiel, Commissioner Blanche Carney, and Commissioner Carlton Williams.
Good afternoon, Executive Director Rice. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Councilman Dom and the members of the City Council Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation Committee. My name is Harvey Rice. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, PICA, the state oversight agency for the City of Philadelphia. Thank you for allowing me to testify today to speak about the city's fiscal year 2021 overtime spending, which encompasses the months of July and August of 2021. I have a slide outlining what we have seen so far in the overtime spending for FY 2021. Okay, so far this year, as you can see, if you look at the total, and this is only departments with overtime costs are shown. So some departments that didn't incur any overtime cost in either of the 2 years are not on this list. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, these are only preliminary numbers and it's only 2 months out of the year. But as you can see, there is a $14 million decrease in overtime cost for 2021 as compared to 2020. And that number, the 25 million, might even be lower as the reimbursables come in for some overtime costs through certain departments. And usually we compare year over year, and we also compare cost to the allocation by department, but PICA has not received those allocation numbers yet. So we were unable to do that for these 2 months. So if anyone has any questions, I'm available to answer them in regards to the overtime cost for fiscal 2021.
So, Executive Director Rice, I have some questions I'd like to ask you. If I'm reading this correctly, the police overtime from the 2020 period compared to the 2021 period has dropped dramatically.
Yes.
Which is
Right.
impressive, very impressive.
Yes. And
More
then
than 50% drop.
And that could be even further drop depending on how much reimbursables are included in that 8 million figure.
That's very impressive. We went from, for the period of 2020, 17 million down to 8.2, which is a savings of 8.9. That's impressive. And I guess the largest overtime right now is the fire department, which also reduced, but percentage-wise, maybe 5% or so.
Yes.
So that's the police and fire. I'd say police, fire, streets, and prisons probably make up, would you say, maybe 90% of the total overtime of the city?
Yes,
So
almost
would
90%.
Right. Would it make sense for us to mostly focus our energy and time on that 90%, which already, it seems like it's already reducing a bit? That seems like most productive.
Right. We, as you can see in our report, the top four, and then we add the other 6 departments. They're the ones that we're really concerned about. They're the ones we want to meet with the city for the allocation plans and the targets, instead of smaller numbers, smaller departments who might not have overtime costs but had them because of the COVID, such as, what was that department? There was one department that needed to, wasn't commerce. It was a department that had no overtime but needed, I forget what it was for, but due to COVID, they needed to do some work for the city, which required a minimum amount of overtime. But so those departments like that, we don't concentrate on. We concentrate on, one, the big departments with the most amount of overtime costs, plus those departments that continually year after year after year, their overtime costs either grow or don't decrease.
Okay. I'd like to recognize, by the way, Councilmember Maria Quinones-Sanchez, who's joined us. Thank you. Good afternoon. And I guess I have a question for the top 4 departments. I guess I could start with the police commissioner, Commissioner Outlaw. And I have to give you a lot of kudos because you've cut your overtime so dramatically. And I'm just curious how you accomplished that goal, because it's very impressive.
Thank you. So, you know, there's a few factors I think that we're looking at as it relates to the end of last year and actually even the beginning of this fiscal year. We know for a fact that the courts being closed for a significant amount of time had a huge impact on our overtime costs. We're going to see those start to creep up slowly again since the courts reopened in September. But we also know that we should take this very seriously. We've been taking it very seriously. We require, depending on the amount of overtime worked, it requires signatures from a supervisor, and depending again, if it's 4 hours and above, it requires signing off by a captain or above. But then we also recognize that there's salary savings there. And so we're able to identify other areas that we can utilize to bring those numbers down, in addition to any outstanding grant funding that we could use also.
That's great. That's very good job. That's very good. I understand with the courts being closed, that's a piece of it, but still managing and controlling it, what you're doing is important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me go to just going down the list. The streets department, I would have expected, by the way, that Commissioner, that the streets department would have had an increase in overtime and actually had a decrease. And I'm just curious if you want to comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember Dom. So the early projections are showing lower numbers, which is a good sign. However, that is due to the lack of special events that we normally attend every year. We staff numerous events on the Parkway, July 4th celebration being one of them that didn't take place this year. And so we were able to achieve a significant number of savings without having to staff those events. Nonetheless, we still are concerned about the future projections because the pandemic still continues. And as we talked about on our Monday discussion, the tonnage numbers for trash collection is still higher than we were last year. So we are constantly monitoring that. We did put a team together to ultimately monitor how we can reduce overtime. In fact, we put it in as one of our cuts to meet this year's budget and fiscal obligations. So we are monitoring it carefully, and while it's a good sign, we're deeply concerned about what the future holds with the pandemic as it continues to linger on.
All right, well, I'm glad you're focused on it because that's an important area. Let me go to the Commissioner Teal, Fire Department. I noticed you had about a 5% or so decrease in the overtime, and I'm just wondering if there's any other tools that we could utilize in the Fire Department to reduce that even further.
Councilmember, I guess like the others, I think these are early projections. Only 79% of our budgeted positions are filled and operational. We've been hit pretty hard by COVID in terms of staff availability, also additional missions that we've picked up in addition to the thousands of fires, hundreds of thousands of EMS incidents, et cetera, et cetera. We also have not had any special events. That's our second biggest driver, actually, of overtime after minimum staffing requirements is special events. So I think we're also benefiting a little bit from that. I think we're also benefiting compared to FY20. As we know, COVID has been less of an issue over the past couple months than it was towards the end of really for the entire second half of FY20. Keep in mind that firefighters and medics, in addition to doing their regular missions about 1,000 times a day on average, are also supporting a host of COVID-related missions, everything from logistical support for healthcare institutions, daycares, feeding operations, running isolation and quarantine missions. So we still have a lot of work that's happening. So I'm pleased to see this number. Again, everything is driven for us by minimum staffing, and that is both according to national standards and contractual obligations. So we don't have a lot of flexibility. You frankly cannot send a fire engine out the door with one person on board if the other three people are off for whatever reason. So we have to fill those spots to provide safe and effective service. That said, I'm hoping that COVID stays the way it's been. Everybody wear your masks, and hopefully we'll see this number consistently over the rest of the year.
Okay, great. By the way, these numbers that I'm seeing in this report, are they actuals or are they projections? Maybe the director.
Those are actuals through August.
Okay, they're actuals. Let's go to the prisons. I noticed a 38 to 40% drop in the prison overtime. I was wondering if...
Councilman, these are actual numbers. However, they're preliminary, as we've said, because these numbers could drop as reimbursables are collected by the city.
Okay. So let's go to the prison department and just maybe a few comments from the commissioner on how you managed to lower the prison overtime 38% or so.
Good afternoon, Councilman Dom and others on this Teams meeting. We've managed to decrease the overtime costs because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We went into a shelter in place. We continued with essential services only being physical health care, medical, and food. We suspended a number of our programs and services and civilian visitation to mitigate COVID-19. During this period, we also, as the population decreased, we transferred male population to from detention center to the Riverside Correctional Facility to fully utilize and maximize bed space. And that also allowed us to redeploy staff to fill vacancies across the remaining facilities. Again, the major reduction is because of the activities that have been suspended. We anticipate there will be some increase as the courts slowly reopen and build to capacity. And as we transition to phase green, reacclimating ourselves to introducing a new way of doing programming for the inmate population. But those are the major drivers that allowed us to reach the 38% reduction.
Keep up the good work. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to, I guess, Commissioner Outlaw, and just to ask you about the court overtime. Do we have any plan in place of using even technology, if that's possible, in order to cut down on the overtime? Like, we've all had meetings through, remote meetings. Is there any way that we can increase the remoteness of what's needed from officers in the courtroom?
Yeah, I actually think that's a larger question, because we're just kind of adapting as the courts adapt. So as the courts utilize technology, we make sure that we have the technology on the opposite end to be able to do that. But I know that there's larger discussions around that, but it's more so on the court side than on our side.
That's definitely something we should explore to cut down on the overtime. Thank you. Let me go back to you, Director Rice. What departments would you like to see the city focus on with regards to overtime spending? And when you do the math, I understand that these 4 departments that we just spoke to are about 23 million of the 25.2 million of overtime. So they are the bulk, over 90% of the overtime. But what would you like to see us focus on as a city?
In addition, those 4, absolutely. And then in addition, look at license and inspections, streets, fleet management, and then an independent office, the sheriff.
Okay. And another question for you. Given the overtime plan you and the PICA board have seen thus far, do you have any concerns about where we are at this point in the year on mitigating overtime spending issues?
We have concerns because we haven't received any finite targets or amounts that they project to reduce overtime by, either totally throughout the city or by department. That's what we want to continue our discussions with them to get that information sooner than later, so that it's easier to monitor as we go forward each month. So that's one of our concerns, is while they've laid the groundwork for an overtime reduction plan, we haven't seen concrete targets and concrete numbers of what they want to get the savings down in overtime.
Okay. I guess this is a question for the administration. First and foremost, I think it's important that we set monthly targets in the spending of overtime. And every year there are events that will lead us to higher overtime spending. We understand that. So the trend is consistent in that we're always, though, over budget on overtime. I'm wondering if the administration, maybe Rob or Marissa, will commit to providing us monthly budgets for each of the top 4 or 5 highest spending departments, probably 4, for the remainder of fiscal year 21, and then report back to council on the actuals on a monthly basis for the overtime. Is that a possibility?
So Marissa Waxman, Budget Director. So we can definitely make information available about the actual spends. That's something we already provide on a monthly basis to PICA, and can certainly make that available. We're in the process right now of working with departments to refine the OT estimates. And if you want to actually have a short presentation, I can do on what the game plan is on the overtime action plans. And so we'll be looking at what is the right frequency for reporting, also whether or not we want to put in some other reserves in place, because a good chunk of overtime, particularly this past year between COVID, between a refinery explosion, are things that aren't planned. So we don't quite know, if a refinery is going to explode in June or in March. So monthly is a little hard for that sort of thing, but we're going to be disaggregating between different types of overtime and what drives them. So some things are going to be predictable. We'll know more about that. But obviously there's a lot that's unpredictable. So, we can share a bit more as we go through this, what we're doing, but there's definitely that data is available as it comes to actual, and we can track it against overall Class 100 spending, because there are trade-offs within the entire personnel budget.
Okay, I understand. So is it possible for us to get that information on a monthly basis?
Sure, the actuals, yes.
Councilman Dom, this is Councilwoman Sanchez. Can I add to that, since you're asking for a return? Thank you so much. I think it's really important, and I'm glad that the commissioners brought up the issue of special events. So I think that any kind of report, first of all, in setting goals, it's real important for the administration to break away what is special events related as it relates to their reduction. And I keep hearing people say about what's reimbursable, whether something's going to be CARES Act reimbursable or not. The issue of managing over time should be separate from what gets reimbursed in general fund and not, because it speaks to what other management issues we have. So to the extent that Marissa could break that down, I think then you will be able to see who's managing the budget versus the budget managing them. I understand that there's some unforeseen situations, but I think that in order for us to determine what are the legitimate uncontrollables, then deciphering some of this data will help tell the story. And as it relates to goals, I think all those things should be taken into consideration. What I don't want is, your department tells us, well, we're gonna reduce by 20%, and that's the special events when no special events are happening. That's not sufficient. That doesn't mean we're managing it better. So I just want that clarified. So whatever the administration decides is going to report back to the committee, that we're being transparent around some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Sanchez. Thank you. Is that possible, by the way, Marissa, to incorporate?
Yeah, we can certainly talk about that. And I believe also part of what Harvey was talking about in terms of reimbursable overtime is we do have some departments like L&I offers expedited service that customers who want expedited service pay for. And then we use overtime in order to speed things along. And so those are some of the reimbursements we get. So they're managed. Similarly, the police department provides services for a whole range of things. Some are special events, but some might be providing extra public safety services around a bank or retail stores. And those banks or retail stores then pay us, or a movie production. And so there are certain things that the overtime is expended, but we're also actually collecting for that from the folks who have asked for those services.
So Marissa, I just want to clarify. I think that what we're trying to get to, especially in a conversation about what tasks police do, to the extent that you can break those down to tasks, right, and specific things. I know that we postponed the traffic police and, the traffic officers and some other things. That may be a reason for us to ramp those up as opposed to delay them, because even though they're going to get reimbursed, it doesn't make sense to have the police department doing some of those things, right? And so I just think in this context where we're talking about, we've dumped everything on the police and we want to move away to be more targeted. I think that's exactly the kind of things we want to see, so that we can help make those kind of policy shifts. Thank you.
Yeah, we can absolutely, the police in particular has a number of different codes so that we can easily break that out.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, are there any actual written overtime plans currently? I think you mentioned something, Marissa. Maybe you want to discuss that.
Sure. So what PICA asked us to do this year as a condition of approving the 5-year plan was to do an analysis and origins, and then it'll move into action plans for the city's use of overtime. And a little bit of background, and if you want, I can throw up slides. But basically, overtime is a way we get work done. It's typically 1.5 or 2 times regular pay for additional hours. And as you noted, it's really concentrated. It's more than 80% in police, fire, and prisons. You get to over 90% in if you add in streets. And so last year we spent a little over $200 million. That's about 4% of the general fund. And, in general, about 63% of the general fund budget is on our people costs, and that's benefits, salaries, overtime, all of that together. And so we really look at overtime as a tool. It's what we get work done, and there are alternatives. You could hire more people. You could do technology and productivity enhancements. You could use vendors. You could also choose to reduce services or reduce the quality of services we provide. So there's a lot going on. And so what we did for the sort of phase 1 of what we provided to PICA, and you can also find it on our website, and it was also, I believe, provided to the council's technical staff, was one, we did a historical look at overtime spending by department over the past 5 years. And what we did was when we did that dive into the historical analysis, we broke that down into 3 categories. We had departments that were consistently meeting or under budget on both their overtime and on their entire Class 100. We had a group of departments that were consistently over on their overtime budget, but not their overall Class 100. And then there was a group of departments that consistently, and when I say consistently, I mean at least 3 out of the past 5 years, had exceeded both their Class 100 and their overtime budgets. And so that group of departments are the ones that we'll be developing action plans for. And then at the request of PICA, we're, even though the prisons has not consistently exceeded their Class 100 overtime, because they are such a large department, we'll also be doing one for prisons. So those are our priority departments, where we'll be going in and doing real assessments of what are the drivers in those departments, because there's a lot of different reasons. It might be vacancy rates. It might be leave usage, like we talked about this morning. It might be those unplanned circumstances. It might be just sort of structural deficiencies that they've never been funded or staffed to do the work that they're given. Then there's departments that have seasonal and variable needs. I have a background in the revenue department, and we would never staff year round the way that we need to provide coverage during tax season. And then in other areas, it might be due to service enhancements or things that come up during the course of the year. So there's a lot of different drivers, and the situation is going to be different, not only department by department, but within each program. And so we're going to be doing these assessments with departments. Our target budget process actually would have started today, but for these hearings, but starts tomorrow, where we go through department by department to see how their budget is lining up and actually begin to do those projections payroll by payroll for the rest of the year. And so what we do is we look at that, we see if it's realistic. We'll see, particularly since so many or the concentration of this is in our public safety agencies, and they don't hire the same way other departments do. They don't, if Bob retired on Friday, Jim doesn't start on Monday. They do classes. And so it's not like you have that smooth one-for-one sort of backfilling in a typical year. And so there is that unevenness. And so that's what we look at. So we know we had a lot of unique drivers for FY20. Looking at FY20 numbers is just sort of mind-boggling, between COVID, the refinery, civil unrest, and social activism. Council member Quinones-Sanchez was just asking for the breakout of the different types of overtime. The line item that the police use to track their overtime for things that include civil unrest increased 1,100% in FY20. And so that's not really the sort of thing that we would have planned for. So we've got those unique drivers in addition to those standard things. And so as we develop for that group of departments that either that exceeded Class 100 and their overtime budget, we're going to be taking a holistic approach, not just to look at the cost, but also the hours, because costs can change just as we have changes in our wages and labor rates. We're going to be comparing to the target budget. We'll be looking at productivity, the share of all spending, but also what it means for performance. And so basically where we go from here is that we're going to continue all of our current reporting. So we do monthly overtime reports to PICA, and you've asked today if that information could be made available to council as well, and we'll continue to do that. We also do a quarterly memo to PICA that it has much more narrative attached to it, which is, why there's different overtime or why things may be looking different than anticipated. And then in our quarterly city managers report, we report the overtime each quarter. So we're going to keep doing that. We'll be, by the end of the calendar year, and really teeing up also to make sure that we're budgeting correctly for FY22, evaluating the OT allocations within Class 100. We have departments that, they always stay within their overall Class 100, but maybe their overtime isn't where we expect. And that might just be, that's more a budgeting issue as opposed to a management issue. So we want to look at that. We also know that PICA's raised concerns that we had a couple of departments that didn't expect any overtime and had some, but it was usually minimal. So we were thinking about, maybe do we just give everybody a departmental OT reserve, just so that if it's $1,000, $3,500, not anything material to the city's overall picture. Departments aren't, going from zero to something, and that causes alarm bells to go off. But then is really the meat, I think, what folks are interested in, which is operational action plans. And that'll be for those administrative departments that are consistently exceeding Class 100 and OT. They're going to be jointly developed by the department, the mayor's office, budget and finance, the CAO, and the impacted cabinet member, most often the managing director's office. There'll then be quarterly reviews to monitor adherence and progress with that. So that work is underway. We've sort of disseminated out to the commissioners the information about what we got from the historical analysis. We're teeing up what the assessments to look at those drivers are. And one of the reasons we're including CAO in that process is that we want to understand if there are human resource barriers or challenges, or IT barriers or challenges that are causing OT to grow. We want to make sure that we're working holistically to sort through that. So that's where we're going. And so those action plans will include a diagnosis of overtime drivers, alternative means of service delivery. We'll also look at the impacts on performance of OT, impacts on performance if we reduce overtime. And so we plan to have recommendations by the end of December, and those will be made public. We'll share them with PICA, and then, as I mentioned, do quarterly reviews. And so the departments that will be included in that are police, fire, free library, Office of Property Assessment, public property, managing director's office, public health, and prisons. And we've also made an offer, because when we did that analysis, we did it for all city departments. And so we've made the information available as well to the independent offices. And if they'd like to work on that with us, the ones that had been going over OT in Class 100, we'll make those resources available if they would like as well.
Okay.
That was a lot. I'm sorry. I get fired up.
Yeah, I have a couple questions for you. You know, the general public will look at this and say, hey, in the last few years, you've hired 1,000 new people, and your overtime in general goes up higher every year. And what that looks like to the public, like, what is going on there? Okay, like, what is the issue? So that's one question. And then the second question is, I don't know if you know the numbers on this, but I remember Rob telling me the numbers a few years ago. You know, overtime costs, as you said, could be 1.5 to 2 times, I guess, the basic rate. But hiring a new person also has a cost associated with it, which the fringe benefits and all the overhead. And I don't know if you have a number that also includes pension benefits, but would you have that number just to compare it versus the overtime?
Not off the top of my head, and it'll vary on who you hired and who was earning the overtime. But that's exactly why we want to dive deep into this. We really don't think overtime is inherently good or bad. It's a tool, and when it's the most efficient and most effective tool, it's the one we're going to want to use. But we think it's important to really dive deeper to figure out if there are times where it's not the most efficient and effective, then we won't. And so looking at those trade-offs of, would hiring an extra person deliver the same level of service at less cost or more cost? We want to know that. And so I go back to my tax season thing. It doesn't make sense for us to be staffed up 365 days a year like it's April 15th. And certainly you're not, and other things you might do, other alternatives to overtime, like outsourcing that to an outside call center or bringing in temps. Well, they're not going to have the subject matter expertise. They're not going to know how to work our system. So really the most efficient thing to do is, if we want to be open nights and weekends to provide better service to taxpayers, we do that primarily with our own staff who already are the experts and they work more that time of year. Those are examples of when clearly overtime makes the most sense, but we know that that's not every situation. And so that's why we want to be really deliberate. We wanted to not just sort of come out with, we're going to cut overtime 5% or 10%, because that wouldn't be meaningful if we also wanted to understand, well, what other costs might have to rise if we wanted to provide the same level of service, or how might services decline if we made that decision. And so we want to make sure we've got all the full picture of what's any change like that would mean.
So, I think in general, I think people would be maybe more accepting of the overtime if they didn't see the employee count go up so much over the last 4 years, because usually it's one or the other. And in this situation, it's been both. And I think that's where there's a lot of concern over the overtime, because we're increasing the employees and increasing the overtime.
Yeah, I think we can also do a better job for the city overall of explaining where we've added entire new services, things that we didn't used to do or provide, because that kind of get lost in that shuffle if you're thinking we're doing the same old thing, but with more people and more overtime.
And so in the administration, who is in charge of tracking and managing the overtime spending from all the departments?
So that's information in terms of like having the data, sharing that out. Departments individually have that. They work with their cabinet members, but also, as I mentioned, the budget office makes that information available monthly to PICA, quarterly publicly through the QCMR. And so that's always in all of our budget documents, that information.
But who in the administration is overseeing? Is there one person overseeing it or not really?
I think that there's the budgetary and the operations management. And so budgetary we do through budget and finance. And as I said, we break that out between looking more holistically at class 100 is sometimes more meaningful than looking just at OT in isolation. So these are conversations we have with departments on an ongoing basis throughout the year on the budget side. On the management side, that's commissioners working with their cabinet members who obviously report to the mayor.
Would it make sense to have one person overseeing this big expense with the goal to make sure it's efficient, and whether it's the hiring of new people or lowering the overtime or whatever, or vice versa, where one person's total responsibility is that number is too high, we need to get it down. How are we going to go about doing it? Do we do it through new hires or do we do it through overtime? Now, what is the goal? And that person's totally focused on it, because this is a lot of money we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's about 4% of the budget. And I think part of what we're hoping to do through this process of doing the assessments in the departments and bringing in actually the different areas of subject matter expertise who will be able to try and understand, can we address it through technology or HR or management, by having CAO, the cabinet members, mayor's office budget, is that because there is a lot of nuance and difference between what drives it department by department, I think what's most important for us is to really understand the unique drivers for agencies and not have sort of a single approach or strategy, because I think that will produce weird outcomes in some areas and work for others. So I think that by going through this process and really understanding what is driving overtime, and then being able to make the assessment, when does it make sense versus when is it something we change, from that we might learn with how do we want to, if we want to manage it differently. But we've got to do that work up front to really understand the sources and when does it make sense versus when might alternatives be more efficient and effective.
So how is actually overtime assigned in the departments? Certainly if it's not spread out among all members, then there's a risk for more senior and expensive personnel to drive up the costs. How is that all determined?
So I believe there are a number of civil service rules and things within our labor agreements. I think it might be easier if maybe some of the commissioners explain, because I don't believe it's the same department by department. So I don't have one blanket answer to give for citywide.
Does any of the department has maybe Commissioner Outlaw want to maybe answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, for us, especially recently, it's all been driven by a lot of the rallies and social activism and civil unrest. But in addition to that, our crime plan numbers we call it Code 64 overtime. A lot of that is driven also by our crime stats as well. So if there's a specific need, if we need to increase visibility in certain areas as it relates to violent crime, or recently, as a lot of you are aware of, with ATV details, depending on what the need is, that will determine the size of an overtime operation and then also the frequency and duration. So, a great example would be for today, right? Determination comes out of Louisville, we extend shifts. And we have to notify folks contractually by a certain time to know that their shifts are going to be extended. Now, I leave it to my management to scale it back in a timely manner if we determine that we don't need all of the bodies that we're planning for. Or, for example, we have 3 protests that just popped up today for this evening. If we start to see the numbers smaller than the number of officers that we have scheduled to be there, we'll slowly begin to peel back as need be. But lately, it's really been on a case-by-case basis as it relates to civil unrest, but then as it relates to crime, it's where the data takes us.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to thank, by the way, Executive Director Harvey Rice. I know he has to leave, and thank you for your testimony this morning and this afternoon. Thank you, Executive Director Rice. Thanks for participating. Let's go to Commissioner Thiel. Maybe you want to take a crack at that question also.
Councilmember, we fill about 200 positions a day on overtime. They all are for different roles.
And as a result, it's a very complicated set of, you've heard all the dimensions there already, a very complicated set of things that are in the contract, various qualifications. For instance, our fire marshals, we have a very limited number of fire marshals and we have a lot of fires. So, we have to bring fire marshals back to do fire investigations pretty much every day because we don't have enough fire marshals in our base to cover the demand. And then obviously we're having firefighter EMTs working on overtime every day because we're about 50 positions short of single role EMS providers to staff ambulances, including the busiest ambulance in the nation. And when we have particular COVID missions or in the wake or actually preparing for Hurricane Isaias, we don't want to leave anything out. So we also had a hurricane this year. And some of those positions that we staffed up to be able to make those 200 some odd rescues in Eastwick and Manayunk were specialized positions with, folks with technical rescue qualifications, et cetera. So where we can, we try to balance out overtime distribution. Local 22 is a great partner in that. They have a vested interest as well in balancing that out as much as possible within, a host of parameters. It's a very complicated role, and it's something that takes a lot of time each day for our command staff.
Okay, thank you. I think Councilmember Sanchez maybe had a question. Maybe not. Okay, maybe that was the question before. So I have another question I was going to ask. Maybe it's Rob or Marissa could answer this. This report mentioned that improving productivity through technology investment, maybe even legislative changes and business process reengineering, could help us to reduce overtime usage. Who in the administration is responsible to find these opportunities to improve that productivity? And who should we expect to hear from for suggestions on any legislative changes we can make to be a partner in this to help improve our efficiency and save money?
It's really responsibility throughout the government. The departments really the ones who can best figure out whether there are opportunities for improvements in their processes. The central agency that has the most direct responsibility for that is the Chief Administrative Officer, and they work with departments on projects to improve efficiency. Could be through IT, so IT has a big stake in that, but it's really departmental driven, working centrally with CAO.
Okay. And another question I have, you might want to answer this, Rob. How does overtime get factored into the pension calculations for the employees outside of the FOP and IAFF bargaining units? And what's the relationship between overtime spending and our pension obligations?
Yeah, so it depends on the union that someone's in and actually how long they've been working for the city. So you mentioned police officers and firefighters, and overtime's not calculated into their pensions. For anybody hired in the last 30 years in Plan 87, their overtime, their pension is based on an average of their 3 highest years of compensation, and pension is part of that calculation. So it's factored into it as part of an analysis of their 3 highest years of compensation. For people who were in the system before that, it's based on 1 year highest compensation.
So according to this report that we saw today on the overtime spending differences, it seems to me that if police and fire are not calculated in, with their 3 highest years, it looks like they represent 77, 78%, just those 2 entities of overtime. Right. So that the impact that we've always heard in the past, it's great, but it's not the end of the world. It's 20 or 22% that is impacted by the overtime spending on pension calculation.
That's right. And because it's averaged over a few years, it can also be lessened as a result.
Okay. Are there any other questions from any of my colleagues? Seeing none, I want to thank everybody for their participation on this panel, and I'd like to go to the second panel. And thank you all for participating. Really appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Thank you. It's impressive to see the overtime down, even though I know there's certain reasons, but we have a good goal here to try to achieve more savings here. So thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Gerbeck, let's call panel 2. I promised it might be on time at 3:30, and we're pretty close.
Great. The last panel is Tumor Alexander, Cynthia Figueroa, Ann Fedulin, and Sylvie Gallier-Howard.
So I'd like to welcome Tumor Alexander, who now serves as the interim managing director. Welcome, Tumor. I believe this is your first hearing in your new role. I think it is. Anyway, thank you for being here, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, sir. Look forward to working with you all as well.
So, Tum, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make on anything that we've talked about, Tumor, or I can have some questions. But if you want to give us your the first. How many days has it been, Tumor?
I've not counted. I've not counted, council member. I've just seen. I mean, they seem to mesh together, like I'm sure they are for most folks in dealing with all of the issues we're dealing with, whether that's the pandemic or other issues. So I haven't been one to sort of count how many days, how many hours, how many minutes it's been, because it's all sort of been just meshing in.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being our interim managing director. So I guess I have a few questions I could ask you. It revolves around, and you're new in this, so you may have an answer, you may not, but just something to think about. Accountability and management of performance, of course, is paramount to all of us. And we want to make sure our city runs smarter, faster, and better, even in the worst of times, if we can. And the city council is responsible for approving an annual budget, as you know. But in the past, we have lacked information regarding the impact of our decisions. And it's in part because we haven't received a clear sense from the administration as to what the city's getting for the $5 billion roughly it spends each year. So, I mean, having a public conversation about where we're holding people accountable is what this body is supposed to do. So we'd like to get as much information as possible, basically, to make educated decisions from council on legislation. So I'll give you an example. In January, the administration put out a report on the mayor's priorities for a second term. Then in March, it set out his budget priorities for fiscal year 21. Then the pandemic arrived and the mayor issued a revised budget with revised priorities. Then there were historic protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and civil unrest. So the mayor issued another revision to the budget. And given everything that has happened, can we get some answers to the following questions? 1, what are the overall goals today for the administration? 2, what are your goals, Tumor, for your group or departments or offices this fiscal year? And how do you manage accountability for those departments against those goals? And how are the budget dollars aligned or prioritized within those goals?
Thank you, Councilmember. I think as it relates to the mayoral goals, they're the same. It's the quality education for all, a safer and more just Philadelphia, health equity for all, and an inclusive economy, thriving neighborhood. And I would say my goals don't differ from that. Clearly, we all work for the mayor and for the administration. So my job is sort of making sure departments are supporting those goals and we're delivering those operations in an efficient way, in a way that we're transparent and reflective to citizens about their needs and making sure we're communicating with folks. And the way we sort of hold each other accountable is that we work directly with department heads and their executive teams and with the mayor's office, you've heard from Rob and Marissa from finance and from other cabinet level officials to make sure that we set objectives for ourselves, we set targets for ourselves, that we monitor those targets, that we're helping departments manage through that. If it's more, checking with departments to see if there's resources they need to sort of manage through. Is there adjustments we should be making? And a lot of these conversations are sort of daily and ongoing with departments. I mean, it's probably not a day that's passed that I haven't spoken to one of the commissioners that joined us in the last panel about all of their activities and efforts. It's been days to where commissioners will call and say, if you want to take an example, look at the issue Streets was having as it related to sanitation pickup. And that was an issue that a bunch of different departments and cabinet members jumped on and put some resources to and some brain power to and figure out how can we help fix the situation? How can we help satisfy the sort of concerns? And ultimately, it led to an improvement on services for the citizens.
So I realize we're in a pandemic now, so I know that things are extremely challenging, and you've been in that job just a few weeks, I believe. But Going forward down the road, how do you specifically hold department heads accountable for their goals and targets throughout the year?
I think we work. So first of all, I think myself. So I work for the mayor and the mayor's chief of staff. So the mayor and the mayor's chief of staff will hold myself accountable. I hold departments accountable, and we work together, right? And this may take the form of, reporting out, whether that's public documents, whether that's regular meetings and reports, just ongoing communications. But we sit down and we get together, and you see some of this reflected in the QCMR reports. And we look at those targets. We look at, are we meeting those targets? How can we, if we're not meeting them targets, what can we do better? Why is it that we're not doing it? What changes can we make? A lot of times, especially in this environment, we don't have more resources. So it's about how can we be more creative? You talked a little bit on the last panel about how can you use technology differently to sort of help support some of these goals. So I think it's the entirety of all of that.
And by the way, I think, too, the more we can look at technology to make ourselves more efficient in this world, because we're going to see in the next 10 years a totally different world than what we are seeing today, and it's going to be technology driven. So the more we can advance our own systems and technology, the better we will be. So I guess the overall question is will each department have formal requirements monthly as to what their goals are and how it's tracked, or how does that exactly work?
Well, we track it. We set the goals. We set the goals yearly, and then we track it quarterly, Alan. But in between that time, that we typically meet with our department heads and go over those goals and just making sure we're either on track or where we are off track and how to course correct. But a lot of that is reflected in the quarterly managers report. Like I said, it's in conversations that we're having, certainly with budget and finance, and also just in daily meetings or weekly meetings, actually, that we're having with the mayor's office and with other cabinet members.
Okay, thank you, Tumar, thanks. I guess I see Sylvie here, and I want to ask you a question on commerce. I know we've talked about the small businesses and what's needed in small business in dollars. Do you have any kind of budget number that you think would satisfy, could be a huge number maybe, but would generally help all those small businesses in the corridors that are so important to us to make sure that they survive and keep those jobs in place?
It is a huge number. Yeah. So I think what we heard from the state program for the first round of funding is that there was, I believe, an $80 million gap in terms of funding just for Philadelphia businesses alone. And my understanding is that the second round that they did is a bigger number. And I think that's going to be, we'll hear about that in, any number of days now, I'm hearing. So it's much bigger than anything that the city alone can tackle. And we really need assistance from the federal government. We were really hoping we'd get another, infusion on a number of fronts. I know we all hope for that. And then also, the state did a lot with a $225 million program statewide. And I understand that there's efforts to try to put more there, but it's a really big number.
Has the state money been fully allocated?
The COVID dollars or the 225 million?
225.
It will have been once they make this announcement, I'm sure.
Okay. So I'd like to ask all the panelists just a simple question, and that is, how do the goals relate to the budget? And how can you connect those two for us? And I'd like each of you to take a crack at answering that question. How does the goals that you have relate to your budget? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go. I'll raise my hand.
Okay.
Good afternoon, council member. Thanks for having us. So ours are very much driven to the total number. The largest department in the Office of Children and Families is the Department of Human Services. And so looking at the number of youth in care, as well as looking at what is the most expensive level of care, which is residential. And so our targets to reduce total population is on track, as well as the target to reduce the number of kids that are in residential care on track. So we look at, I was listening to the questions you asked, Tumar, which is we're looking both at daily, weekly, and monthly reports. So we have a sense from a week-to-week basis if there's a consistency or a shift in trend. So I would say ours is tracks both the quality but the level of care and how that impacts the cost of our own budget.
Okay, thank you. I see Ann Fadulin's on, so Ann, you want to take a crack?
Yeah, so for our, good afternoon, Councilman. For our performance measures, most of them have to do with our housing services. So we track how many home repair cases we're able to handle. We also, how many affordable units we're providing. This year we'll probably add in rental assistance because we've took that on in a big way during the pandemic. And then our other performance measures really deal with our performance. How quickly are we processing payments? How quickly are we getting projects through the development process? Are we complying with all the requirements as far as zoning board of adjustment notices? How quickly can we get people their hearings? Those kinds of things. And so that's how we measure our performance. On top of that, we also have on our website a dashboard that shows how we're doing with our housing action plan. It tracks a number of metrics, and we're actually in the process of looking at that and seeing if we have gaps from some of our other efforts so that we can incorporate more of our measures all into one space as easily as possible. Per the land bank and the strategic plan, we have to report on our annual goals there, and that's also in our performance measures. But since we have these kind of in 3 or 4 different places in kind of a little bit different language each time, one of the things we're very much working on is trying to capture everything in one place, easily accessible, easily understood, and that's something that we're working on right now.
Okay, thank you. Sylvia, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. So for performance-based budgeting, we have a number of metrics that we track every quarter. So those are the number of businesses we support. So for example, during the COVID period, we've supported over 6,000 businesses with responses around all sorts of questions, but a lot of it related to reopening or closures. We look at our leads in terms of business attraction and our wins and the number of jobs. So we look at the number of jobs when it comes to business attraction and retention as well. We also track jobs in terms of the businesses that we support on the commercial corridors and through our business technical assistance providers. So we have contracts with a lot of different CDCs or business technical assistance providers, and they have to report to us on all of their metrics. We also track participation on a quarterly basis and how we're doing as a city, our quasi-city agencies, and how we're doing in terms of minority women-owned participation, workforce, and contracts. We look at vacancy levels. We have our performance metrics for the budget, and then we track a whole bunch of other things quarterly as well, like all our quarter cleaning, the number of trash bags picked up, litter index is sort of done on an annual basis. And now that we have workforce, there's a number of metrics around that as well. We also track macroeconomic statistics, so unemployment, poverty, all those things, but we like to really know what are the things we directly impact in addition to kind of what are the things we're contributing to, which is, the more macro level statistics.
Thank you. Very good. I think is there a representative here from the Chief Administration Office? No? Okay, no problem. I think there's a question from one of my colleagues, Councilmember Quinones Sanchez.
Thank you, Councilman Dom, and this is for Tumar and then obviously to the rest of the members. We didn't do zero-based budgeting. We really haven't done performance-based budgeting, and it still seems to me that there's a lot of measuring, but I don't see the connection and the alignment to some of the issues that we've all been talking about. One is poverty. If I ask each one of your departments, what are you doing around poverty? If I ask each one of your departments, what are we doing to tackle some of the gun violence? What are we doing? Because, in our gun violence discussion, we had a whole discussion about many of the children who have been victims have been in our system somehow or our housing. So the question is to Tumar, how is he going to better manage the alignment? You can measure a whole lot of things, but working towards common goals is a little bit more than just measuring things. So I'd like to, what is going to be different now in aligning some of those to meet some of these really, really difficult needs that COVID has just highlighted around equity, around, reaching some of these folks in deep poverty? What's going to be different?
Yeah, thank you, Councilwoman. I think mostly what's going to be different is just our attention to this and how we are. You called out couple, right? You called out poverty, you called out gun violence reduction. And on both of those instances, you have the multiple departments and multiple eyes and cabinet members working on that issue, right? For instance, with gun violence, there was a weekly meeting with not only you would think it would be just police or just Office of Violence Prevention, but it's also departments like CLIP, departments like L&I, departments like Health and Human Services, whether that's DBH, whether that's the Department of Health, whether it's also Commerce, and Sylvie has a piece of that, right? But that's all of us coming together collectively to look at what part do we play in the solutions to these issues. I think priority is sort of the same way. As you see us move forward and as you see the mayor start to realign some of the some realignment that's going to come to MDO, but some realignment that's also going to take place with the other cabinets, you'll see that'll get defined out in a little better way. Like you'll see some initiatives lifted up, and you'll see they won't be under a certain. For instance, let me speak towards managing director's office. You'll see some initiatives that won't be under a certain deputy managing director, but those initiatives will sort of be on a dotted line directly to the managing director. And purposefully so is that I want to make sure that all of our departments are paying a lot of attention and we're putting resources to this. A lot of this isn't about, what new resources we can put. It's about how do we redesign the resources we have? How do we get other partners to the table? I will say that all of the folks that's on this call, Cynthia, Sylvie, and certainly Ann herself have played and try to put forth efforts to how could I help as it relates to violence prevention. And in her housing world, you may think don't have a piece to play in that, but she has, right? And she's offered up some of those resources for this. So I think it's a way we realigning those resources to tackle those issues. And certainly poverty is the same. I just did a bunch of thought process with the council president regarding the program that he's going to announce pretty soon as one of the poverty reduction initiatives. So I think it's that sort of collaboration that'll help us get through this.
I'm pleased to hear you say realignment, because I do think that this notion that every time we start something new, there's not enough money. I think there's a lot of things in a post-COVID world where 40% of our work was community engagement, and that has changed. For departments to not come back, drastically changing their modus operandus and realigning, means that we're not holding them accountable to that, right? And so I'd like to see, departments, and I've said this publicly, you guys have all heard me, and I know y'all think it's harsh. We can't have personality portfolios. We have one mayor, one mission, we have to have some common goals. And the mission is to serve people, right? And to be good stewards of their tax dollars. And then we have some common goals around, protecting the most vulnerable, lifting people out of poverty, keeping people out of poverty, and all of those things. And where is the accountability piece? Because in the past, it's been really, really frustrating to get people to move in a different direction. And, again, I've repeated this over and over. We have departments that are still doing the same thing, and the world has changed and evolved. How are you going to hold those accountable for the realignment that is necessary if we're all, because people don't separate government. I'll tell you that all the time. I get cursed out at Kensington. I wish the mayor would come out and join me and get cursed out every once in a while. But it's one government. So, how do we make sure that people feel like we are trying to be more synergetic and responsive?
Councilwoman, I just want to echo two more sentiments and highlight a few things. I think that what we've been able to accomplish in the wake of COVID, I think has really elevated some of the issues that you brought up, using existing infrastructures to support really big, huge problems. So, that was true of the food access work, and that's been true of even the access centers. So there wasn't new money brought to the table, but using existing resources and city assets to tackle a really bigger problem. And I think that we've been looking in the Office of Children and Family around, we are actually doing performance-based contracting for our largest contracts with the CUAs. And that we have a very clear understanding that there's a case ratio. So once they fall behind that, there's a reduction. So it is very budget specific. So it's a small example, but definitely moving in that area and working with TUMAR and the MDO, because none of this can be done with specific one department tackling these issues, but how do we continue to support and reinvent ourselves through this? I mean, I think we did that with the Summer Work Ready to make sure that kids and older kids still had job opportunities, even though it was going to be a very different kind of summer. So just trying to be as, I think, creative and innovative as possible, given the challenges that we've seen, but agree that we have to continue the synergies and we have to continue the quest for accountability on the resources that government brings to the table.
Yeah. So how do we change from just a money-driven kind of, and the outcomes piece? That's the piece that I want to see, right? And to me, I like to see government do less of feeling like we got to prop up the programs and more of like, how do we put money on the ground to help others who could probably do it, more effectively, more efficiently, and that we don't have to commit long term, right? Sometimes when we prop up programs, they're costly. So, and I'll give you some examples around this food insecurity. I mean, I really think that the amount of work that went into it, very much necessary. Like, I watched the food distribution, the volunteers is just an amazing feat, but it's sort of like, okay, moving forward, how do we create a sustainable model where we're giving people maybe money to spend money in the neighborhoods, right? So then you're helping, you're doing two things. You're giving them food access, but at the same time, you're helping the local economy. That's the kind of innovation I want to see us thinking about long-term, not feeling this need that like we have to do all of this stuff, but how do we help others? How do we help like leverage the money that we're going to put out in the street? And then again, I'm still looking for the accountability of when you can't get the multi-departmental support, how do we hold folks accountable so that we are moving along? I think everybody, and this goes true for the last administration, like it was sort of like people did work around people as opposed to holding departments accountable. So again. Mm-hmm.
Councilwoman, I think one way, and you and I have had conversations when we were doing the small business relief program, which I think we saw firsthand how much work it takes to just stand up a program like that, I definitely agree. Wherever we can sort of, I'll use the word outsource, but get our partners to really play a role in this. I think we want to do that, so, for example, like the CDFIs that have been doing the state grant program as a coalition together, and they kind of work together to find an intermediary. So there's one platform I think is a really great model. Today, we just put out a call for ideas to $1 million that you all help support putting $1 million in Commerce's budget for workforce. We just put out a call for ideas, and that call is for organizations in this space to scale up models that are effective. So that we can support them in doing their job better and, not try to create anything of our own. So I think, to the extent that we can do things like that, I think we definitely want to do that.
Yeah, I would just say on the housing front, I mean, there's a big shift to put a lot more resources towards renters. We could not have done that without our partners. We utilize our housing counseling agencies, our NACs, other CDCs to not only get the word out, but also to take in applications to assist tenants in filling out those applications, to do outreach. The only way we were able to get that out and get as much money on the street as quickly as possible is because we utilized our partners, and we can't say enough about them. We've also stood up the eviction diversion. Again, that is with our partners. We had with our housing counseling agencies and with VIP and community legal services. And then we stood up a couple programs to provide direct landlord assistance. That was through our partner Impact Services. And so we're definitely utilizing our partners because particularly now when we are all very resource constrained, the best tool we have is leverage. And I think a perfect example of that as well, not a program that started during the pandemic, was Philly First Home. I mean, we put in, the city put in $8,700 on that. Over $23 million invested. That leveraged almost over $340 million of private dollars. So that was a great, that was us working with council to come up with that program, but figuring out how do we take what we have and leverage it. As far as doing business a different way, we jumped on this remote learning piece. We now have every program that we have, every system, every process, all our meetings, everything we are online. We are completely remote. We have gotten every single one of our employees a laptop. We are in the process of deploying those because we too believe that this is, this is the future. This is the way work is going to go. And not that we plan on being out and remote for the rest of our tenure, but we want to be able to work as well remotely as we do in the office, and that all our processes and all our programs will be seamless, whether we are in the office or whether we're working remotely.
I appreciate that. And again, I look forward to kind of working through this. I think that there's a high level of frustration. And again, I don't think people are not working hard. I think we just got to work smarter and more effectively. We still have neighborhoods that really don't see and don't feel like, there's equity around resources. And I just think that, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but, I want folks to know that they're going to be measured by how we take care of the most vulnerable. And there's some neighborhoods that you go and we got to figure out how to do a better job of how we're servicing them and how we're leveraging that. So, I'm looking for the accountability piece. I'm looking for the synergy on the goal, on the mission, on the goals, and they have to be people centered. I mean, I think one of the things is the realignment has to be people centered, and I don't want to define, how you guys should how you should be carrying it out, but I do think that to your point, Ann. In the poverty plan, and I know, Council President is working on one of those, but they were in the poverty plan and the poverty discussion, and in the call to action, there were some very specific new ideas around bringing things up to scale. In a post-COVID world, my belief is that we got to double down on some of those. And that means that in order for us to do that, we're going to be in people's spaces. And I hope that people really are open to looking at some of the innovative ideas and saying, how do we do some of these things to help more people, and that we're not wedded to, again, some of the systems that we're just not going to be able to do because in a post-COVID world, you just can't do it. We can't do community fairs like we used to. We can't do all of the other stuff we used to. So we got to be more targeted and more intentional about the work that we're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Tumar. 19 days. Go, boy.
Thank you, Councilmember Sanchez. Thank you. And two more, just the last question. You don't even have to answer it, just some that you can maybe focus on. And that is, it sounds to me like what we're trying to get to is a point where the budget dollars match the goals that work across departments. I think that's generally what we're talking about. So if we can get there, that would really be a positive for all of us. I don't believe there's any other questions from my colleagues. So I want to thank everyone. Appreciate your time today. I look forward to working with you as things progress. I understand there's no other public witnesses for today, so we'll move to closing remarks. I just want to again thank everybody. It's been a long day, and we're discussing the city's current and future financial position, along with the management practices of the city. And despite where we are in this moment of time, we do still spend close to $5 billion in city government dollars. That's a lot of money. So City Council and the public deserve to know what we're achieving for this kind of spending and in this climate. And if something isn't working, now's the time for us to learn about it, shut it down. And if something's showing promise, now's the time for us to double down on that. So I hope the administration will continue to work with council to find solutions and achieve our collective goals. We are in it together. We're a team. The definition of team, together everyone achieves more. And it's our goal to work with all to make the city the best it can be, and the public deserves that. So this concludes the hearing on Resolution 200-406. The hearing's adjourned, and thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Be well.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.